Why this mountain road is closed every winter. The high elevation passes of the northern Sierra Range are subject to weather conditions that can bury a heavy semi-truck in minutes. Local highway department records indicate that one specific stretch of blacktop near the granite peaks has remained gated since 1988. Silas Vance was 56 years old and worked as a lead safety inspector for the Regional Department of Transportation Division. He had spent 30 years evaluating road stability, but he always felt a strange pressure in his ears near the summit. Silas arrived at the lower gate during a gray morning in November with a simple goal to check the seasonal locks. The air was thin and carried the scent of frozen stone and the metallic tang of an approaching heavy snowstorm. He drove his four-wheel drive pickup toward the restricted zone and noticed the pavement was covered in thin black ice. The first strange detail was that the road surface appeared to be steaming despite the temperature being well below the freezing point. Silas saw that the heat was coming from the center line and it was melting the ice in a perfect path. He checked the thermal sensors on his dashboard and found that the asphalt was radiating nearly 90 degrees of localized heat. Silas stopped the truck and walked to the edge of the guardrail to see if there were any underground steam pipes. The maintenance logs showed no geothermal activity in this sector, and no utility lines had been buried beneath the remote mountain road. Silas looked down the steep embankment and saw that the snow was completely gone from a circular patch of rocky earth. He assumed it was a chemical reaction from the road salt, but the smell in the air was sweet and floral. An hour later, Silas found a set of heavy equipment tracks that led away from the road and into the trees. These tracks did not match any of the department plows or the standard tread of a modern commercial or civilian vehicle. Silas followed the markings for 50 yards and found a vintage surveyor rod standing upright in the middle of the brush. The metal was polished and looked brand new despite the harsh mountain environment that usually rusted iron in a single season. Silas checked the serial number on the rod and realized it belonged to a crew that vanished in 1972. That specific team had been tasked with mapping the original route before the road was paved for the local logging industry. It was impossible for the tool to be in such perfect condition after sitting in the forest for several decades. The inspector began to feel a sense of heavy static as he held the cold metal rod in his gloved hands. He decided to return to his truck and check the archived radio logs from the year the surveyor crew went missing. Silas heard a recording of a man named Elias who was calling for a location check during a sudden whiteout storm. Elias reported that the road was turning beneath his feet and that the mountain was moving like a massive living thing. Silas felt a chill when he realized the voice on the old tape sounded remarkably clear and lacked any background wind. He looked at the rod again and noticed that it was vibrating with a low frequency that made his teeth ache. The inspector realized the road was not closed because of the snow, but because of a physical displacement of space. A third anomaly appeared when Silas looked through his binoculars and saw a man in a red jacket standing on the peak. The figure was holding a transit level and appeared to be taking measurements of the clouds that were rolling over the ridge. Silas called out to the man, but the wind swallowed his voice and the figure did not turn or acknowledge him. The man moved with a rhythmic and mechanical grace that suggested he was following a very specific set of internal instructions. Silas checked the local missing person files and found a photo of Elias wearing that exact same bright red parka jacket. When Silas looked through the lenses a second time, the peak was empty and only the gray rocks remained in view. He realized the surveyor was still finishing the job he started 50 years ago during the Great Winter Blizzard. Silas started connecting the dates of the road closures with the cycles of the lunar calendar and the mountain solar flares. He used a red pen to mark the years when the department had reported seeing ghost lights on the high summit. The sightings occurred on the exact nights when the road temperature spiked and the ice began to melt from the asphalt. This pattern suggested that the mountain road was acting as a conductor for an energy source that originated deep inside. Silas felt the ground buckle slightly beneath his boots, even though the seismic monitors in the valley remained perfectly still. He realized the asphalt was not just a road, but was a seal placed over a very thin spot in reality. Silas reached out to a retired foreman who had helped pave the mountain pass back in the late 60s. The foreman listened to the description of the steam, and he told Silas to leave the summit before the sun set. The old man whispered that the road was built with a special volcanic aggregate that was supposed to prevent heavy ice. He claimed the stones were taken from a site that the local tribes had warned the engineers to leave alone forever. Silas looked back at the surveyor rod and realized the notches were moving, as if the metal were slowly breathing. Every name listed in the original crew manifest was actually a descendant of the people who once protected the high peaks. Silas found a note in the foreman diary that described a road that leads to a place without time. The surveyor, Elias, was the last person to stand on the summit before the road was officially gated and locked in '88. According to the final report, Elias had discovered that the mountain was not made of solid granite, but of hollow light. Silas realized the man in the red jacket was not a ghost, but was a part of the mountain itself. He received one final shock when he looked at his own GPS and saw his location was listed as sea level. The figure in the red jacket appeared at the edge of the woods and pointed toward the lower valley gate. Silas turned his truck around and drove down the mountain as fast as the black ice would allow him to. He realized that the ordinary mountain road was a bridge that only opened when the cold air hit the peak. Silas packed his gear and decided to report that the road was structurally unsound and should be decommissioned for public use. He called his supervisor to say that the granite was shifting and that the risk of a landslide was high. The supervisor accepted the report without any questions, as if he had been waiting for an excuse to keep it closed. Silas drove away and watched the summit disappear in the fog as the first heavy flakes of the storm fell. He kept the surveyor rod in his truck as a reminder of the man who was still measuring the peaks. He never spoke about the steam or the red jacket to the other inspectors or to the local media. The road remains closed every winter because the mountain needs to finish its work in the silence of the snow. The mystery of the mountain road remains a secret known only to those who have felt the heat of the asphalt. Experts say that the steam is caused by a natural underground spring that warms the rocks during the winter months. Silas knew the difference between a natural spring and a road that was trying to tell him a long story. He lived the rest of his life watching the mountains from the safety of the valley floor and the sun. The forest holds its secrets in the deep snow, and the wind covers the sound of the surveyor at work. The quiet warnings were real, and the road is still waiting for the next storm to open the door. Silas Vance died, knowing that some places on a map are not meant to be traveled by the living. The Department of Transportation eventually reinforced the gates and added a row of heavy concrete barriers to the entrance. They cited geological instability and unpredictable rockfalls as the primary reasons for the permanent closure of the northern pass. Silas often looked at his old field notes and wondered if the surveyor rod was still vibrating in the basement. He had noticed that the serial number on the rod matched the coordinates of the melting circle on the mountain. This suggested that the tools were not just instruments for measuring, but were anchors for a different kind of reality. The red jacket had become a legend among the younger rangers who claimed to see flashes of color in the fog. They spoke of a man who looked through a transit at things that were not yet built in the valley. Historical archives from the county museum revealed that several other roads in the region had been closed for similar reasons. Most of these trails led to ancient quarries where the stones were supposedly restless and warm even in the dead of winter. Silas had suspected that the entire mountain range was connected by a network of energy that the road had accidentally tapped. He spent his final months writing a manuscript that explained the relationship between the blizzard and the magnetic shifting. The pages were filled with diagrams of the surveyor rods and the way they aligned with the stars above. He knew that his work would likely be dismissed as the ramblings of an old man who spent too much time alone. Yet he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had documented the pattern for the next inspector. Whenever a heavy storm approaches the valley, the residents look up at the dark silhouette of the jagged mountain range. They see the faint glow of the summit, and they know that the road is busy with the work of ghosts. The snow falls in thick blankets that cover the tracks of the man in the red jacket until spring. Silas had left instructions to have his ashes scattered at the base of the ridge near the lower gate. He wanted to be part of the mountain that he had spent so many years trying to understand and map. The road is just a line on a map, but it is also a boundary between the known and the unknown. The gates remain locked, but the measurements continue every single time the temperature drops below the freezing point. The mountain is alive, and it is still waiting for the survey to be finished by the man in red. This ordinary motel room raised serious questions. The quiet stretches of highway in the desert often hide locations that seem to exist outside of the normal flow of time. Local police records indicate that room 212 at the roadside inn had the highest turnover rate in the county. Silas Vance was 54 years old and worked as a regional maintenance manager for a chain of budget motels. He had spent 20 years fixing leaky faucets and broken air conditioning units, but he never liked visiting the desert branch. Silas arrived at the property during a heat wave in 1995 with a goal to renovate the back wing. The sun was beating down on the cracked pavement, and the air smelled like dry sage and old engine oil. He unlocked the door to the corner room and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl. The first strange detail was the placement of the furniture, which did not match the standard layout of the company. Silas saw that the heavy oak desk had been bolted to the floor directly in front of the bathroom door. He checked the maintenance logs and found no record of anyone ever requesting the desk to be moved or secured. Silas moved toward the window and noticed that the glass had been replaced with a much thicker grade of acrylic. The manager told Silas that a guest in 1984 had complained about seeing figures standing in the dunes. This guest claimed the figures were not moving, but were simply staring at the window from the edge of the darkness. Silas assumed it was just a prank played by locals or a trick of the light on the sand. An hour later, Silas found a hidden compartment behind the headboard while he was stripping the old wallpaper from the wall. This compartment contained a small handheld recorder and a stack of notebooks filled with rows of very precise numbers. The notes were dated from 1972 to 1988, and they tracked the exact movement of stars. Silas flipped through the pages and realized the handwriting changed every few years, even though the mission remained the same. It looked like a succession of strangers had checked into this specific room to continue a single long-term study. Silas checked the motel guest registry, but the names used for room 212 were all common and fake. It was impossible to tell who had been living in the room or what they were actually looking for. The investigator began to feel a sense of heavy observation as he worked in the dim light of the room. He decided to play the tape from the recorder to see if it contained any clues about the occupants. Silas heard the sound of heavy breathing, followed by a series of rhythmic clicks that sounded like a telegraph machine. A voice finally spoke on the tape, and it sounded like a man who had not slept for many days. The man said that the pattern was repeating, and that the window was the only lens that stayed focused. Silas felt a chill despite the desert heat because the voice sounded exactly like his own father, who vanished. His father had disappeared during a trip through this valley in 1976 and was never seen again. A third anomaly appeared when Silas pulled up the carpet and found a series of etched lines in the concrete. The lines formed a perfect map of the surrounding mountain peaks and the dry lake beds located to the north. Silas placed his own topographical map over the etchings and saw they matched with a margin of error of 0. One specific spot on the map was marked with a deep red stain that looked like old dried house paint. This spot corresponded to a nearby abandoned weather station that had been shut down by the government in '83. Silas asked the motel manager about the station, but the man claimed that no such building ever existed there. When Silas looked out the thick acrylic window, he could clearly see the white dome of the station glowing. Silas started connecting the dates in the notebooks with the history of the local power grid and the weather station. He used a red pen to circle the nights when the motel experienced total blackouts during the previous 2 decades. The blackouts occurred on the exact same nights that the mysterious guests had recorded the most data in the logs. This pattern suggested that the room was drawing a massive amount of electricity from the main line for something. Silas felt the floor vibrate under his boots, even though there were no large machines running in the motel wing. He realized the room was not just a place for sleep, but was a part of a larger machine. Silas reached out to a retired electrician who had wired the motel back in the late 1960s. The electrician listened to the description of the vibrations, and he told Silas to look under the bathroom floor tiles. Silas broke the ceramic and found a heavy copper cable that ran directly into the earth beneath the desert sand. The old man whispered that the motel was built on top of a natural magnetic fault that distorted radio waves. He claimed that a group of surveyors had used the room as a base to study the bending of time. Silas looked back at the notebooks and realized the numbers were not star coordinates but were timestamps for the future. Every event recorded in the first notebook had eventually come true in the local news over the next decade. Silas found a page that was dated for the current year and saw his own name written in red. The surveyor Elias was the name written at the very bottom of the final notebook found in the wall cavity. According to the notes, Elias had discovered that the room acted as a fixed point in a moving world. Silas realized the man on the tape was not his father, but was a version of the same man. He received one final shock when he looked at the mirror and saw a man in a red jacket. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, but was only visible in the reflection of the glass. Silas turned around quickly, but the corner was empty, and the air was perfectly still and very cold now. He realized that the ordinary motel room was a trap for anyone who noticed the pattern in the logs. Silas packed his tools and decided to leave the motel before the sun went down behind the jagged mountain peaks. He called his office to report that the room was unfit for renovation and should be sealed up with bricks. The manager agreed without asking any questions, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally say it. Silas drove away and watched the motel disappear in his rearview mirror as the first stars began to appear. He kept the final notebook in his glove box as a guide for the years that were yet to come. He never spoke about the motel room to his colleagues or to his family members back in the city. The property was demolished 3 years later, but the concrete foundation remains visible from the high-altitude aerial photos. The mystery of Room 212 remains a secret known only to the few who have seen the patterns. Experts say that the desert heat can cause hallucinations that feel as real as the ground under your feet today. Silas knew the difference between a dream and a stack of notebooks filled with the truth of the coming days. He retired to the coast, but he always kept a compass on his nightstand to check for any vibrations. The desert holds its secrets in the sand, and the wind covers the tracks of anyone who wanders too far. The ordinary motel room is gone, but the questions it raised still echo in the silence of the high desert. The local archives still contain some of the blueprints that Silas managed to save from the motel dumpster that evening. These documents show that the building was designed with a specific orientation that aligned with the magnetic poles of the Earth. Engineers who have studied the plans suggest that the room was intended to be an observation post for atmospheric testing. However, the records do not explain why the electricity usage peaked during solar flares, or why the glass was so thick. Silas spent his retirement years translating the final pages of the red notebook to understand the fate of his father. He discovered that the surveyor Elias had mentioned a doorway that only opens when the temperature drops in the desert. The names listed in the registry were actually the names of people who had been reported missing in the region. Whenever the moon rises over the valley, the locals avoid the patch of ground where the motel once stood. They claim that the air there feels heavy and that the static on the radio becomes unbearable for any driver. Silas had written a letter to the county sheriff explaining the connection between the room and the weather station dome. The sheriff reportedly burned the letter and told Silas to never return to the county for any reason at all. This reaction only confirmed to Silas that the secrets of Room 212 were protected by very powerful people. He kept his silence, but he continued to monitor the news for any mentions of the red jacket sightings. The pattern was still moving, and the room was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The final entry in the notebook was a set of coordinates that pointed to a location deep within the mountains. Silas never went to investigate those coordinates because he knew that once you step through that door, you never return. He lived the rest of his life with the knowledge that the world is not as solid as it seems. The desert sun eventually bleached the red ink from the pages, but the words were burned into his memory. History is full of these ordinary places that hold extraordinary questions for those brave enough to look under the surface. The motel room was just a room until Silas Vance decided to pull back the carpet and see the truth. The warning, hidden in a camper's last dashcam footage. The presence of a dashcam often provides the only objective record of what occurs when a person disappears into the wilderness alone. In many cases of missing hikers and campers, the final frames of footage contain subtle details that authorities originally missed during the initial search. A small silver vehicle was found abandoned at the end of a Forest Service road in the spring of 2022. Inside the car, a dashboard camera was still plugged into the power port, despite the battery of the vehicle being completely dead. Lyle Hendricks was a 48-year-old freelance photographer who specialized in capturing rare nocturnal wildlife in the high desert. He arrived at the remote canyon entrance on a Friday afternoon with the simple goal of setting up his motion cameras. The weather was unusually warm for that time of year, and Lyle expected to stay at his campsite for at least 3 nights. He carried a professional-grade camera bag and enough water to last for several days in the dry heat of the canyon. The landscape was rugged and filled with deep sandstone cracks that could easily hide a man from the view of a helicopter. As Lyle drove his truck along the narrow dirt path, he noticed a series of strange markings painted on the rocks. He followed the winding road until he reached a flat clearing where the trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff. The dashcam recorded him parking the vehicle and stepping out to inspect the area before the sun began to set. Lyle looked toward the horizon and seemed to be tracking something moving quickly through the brush near the base of the cliffs. He returned to the truck and checked his GPS unit before realizing that the signal was fluctuating wildly for no reason. He sat in the driver's seat and the dashcam captured a strange humming sound that seemed to be coming from the ground. A thick layer of dust began to swirl around the hood of the car, even though there was no wind that day. Lyle reached for his radio to call the park dispatch office, but only static came through the small speakers of the unit. He found a piece of notebook paper and wrote a quick note about a light he saw reflecting off the canyon walls. The handwriting on the note was shaky and suggested that Lyle was feeling a sudden sense of physical disorientation or fear. According to local archives, the area where Lyle parked had been the site of several unexplained disappearances since 1975. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple campers reported seeing figures that moved without making any sound at all. Search teams arrived at the clearing 4 days after Lyle was reported missing, but found no signs of a struggle or injury. They found his camera equipment sitting on the ground, but the memory cards had been removed from every single device in his bag. Lyle picked up his dashcam and realized it was the only piece of hardware that still had a recorded file on it. The photographer had decided to keep the dashcam running through the night to capture any movement in front of his truck headlights. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded life staring into the darkness while the internal microphone picked up a rhythmic clicking. Lyle felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped out of the vehicle one last time to investigate the source of the noise. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared from the frame of the dashcam as the clicking sound grew louder. The town was quiet when the investigators finally played the footage back at the local police station several weeks later. The authorities eventually found a working monitor and watched the final 30 minutes of the dashcam file with the volume turned up. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of electronic interference, followed by the sound of a metal door latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the canyon floor. The figure on the screen moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of any hiker they had seen. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn someone about a danger approaching from the hills. The footage described how a large shadow would move across the ground even when the moon was hidden behind the thick clouds. Witness statements from 2022 mentioned similar shadows being seen by a group of geologists working in the same sector. Lyle Hendricks reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his chest as the clicking sound moved closer to his car. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the clearing that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the windshield to develop a network of fine cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the undercarriage of the abandoned truck. Lyle stopped moving for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a strange biological mechanism. The camper whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the high beam lights of the truck. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the battery to die so the clearing would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the tires up to the roof of the vehicle with incredible mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Lyle Hendricks had originally concluded that he likely fell into a deep canyon crevice while hiking. However, the details on the dashcam suggested that the camper was being actively hunted by something that understood how his technology worked. The sheriff paused the video and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the camera stopped recording at exactly 3 in the morning. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the recording matched the heartbeat of a person. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the metal frame of the heavy silver truck. The final few seconds of the video contained a frantic glimpse of a hand reaching toward the lens from the outside. Lyle shouted that the light in the sky was getting larger and was drawing the oxygen out of the surrounding air. He mentioned that he was going to try and run toward the cave system he had photographed earlier that same day. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the car alarm being triggered. Silence filled the room of the station as the screen turned black, without any more images of the canyon or Lyle. The sheriff contacted the Forest Service the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the internal storage of the camera. A technician named Silas Vance examined the digital files and confirmed that the footage had not been tampered with or edited. They returned to the site of the clearing together to look for the cave system Lyle mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the sand that contained a series of sketches and a broken lens. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the jagged canyon floor. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of a cave with glowing patterns etched into its gray, translucent skin. Silas noted that the broken lens had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light source. They realized that Lyle Hendricks had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that has been here since 1900. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in the light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the dashcam footage remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Lyle Hendricks often thinks about the quiet photographer and the warning he tried to leave behind for others. The video serves as a haunting reminder that the desert holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by those who carry cameras. He no longer explores the high desert because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his mind at night. The clearing remains empty and avoided by locals, but the dashcam still holds the final warning of 2022. The final radio check from a remote mountain pass. Search and rescue logs from the winter of 1988 contain a series of confusing entries regarding a high-altitude pass. These internal documents describe a situation where physical evidence simply vanished into the thin air of the northern wilderness. Gideon Vance was a 54-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who spent his summers repairing remote cellular tower generators. He was a man of few words who preferred the isolation of the high country to the noise of the city. Gideon lived in a small cabin on the edge of the national forest and kept his truck in perfect working order. One frigid morning in November, he received a call to check a failing backup battery system at the Summit Pass. The drive usually took 4 hours through winding dirt roads that were now covered in a thick layer of fresh snow. He packed his heavy tool bag and checked his two-way radio to ensure he could stay in contact with dispatch. Gideon pulled his four-wheel drive truck onto the logging road and noticed the sky was turning a dark shade of charcoal. He reported his departure to the base operator and mentioned that the wind was starting to pick up near the timberline. A loud static burst from his dashboard radio made him reach for the volume knob as he climbed the steep grade. He listened closely, but the sound was not coming from the dispatcher or any other authorized frequency in the mountain range. Gideon pulled over to the side of the road and adjusted the antenna to get a better signal from the valley. He heard a faint, rhythmic tapping that sounded like someone was hitting a metal pipe with a heavy wrench or hammer. The mechanic decided to step outside to see if the noise was coming from his own engine or the nearby trees. The mountain pass was completely silent, except for the sound of his own breathing in the cold and biting mountain air. He looked toward the jagged peaks and noticed that the clouds were swirling in a way that looked almost like smoke. Gideon got back into the warm cab of his truck and realized that his radio was still transmitting a heavy signal. He picked up the microphone and asked if anyone was on the channel, but the only response was the strange tapping. The tapping on the radio changed into a low-frequency hum that made the plastic dashboard of his truck vibrate softly. Gideon checked the battery voltage on his diagnostic equipment, but the readings remained steady despite the strange interference on the air. He knew that his equipment was rated for extreme weather and should not be reacting to a simple mountain winter storm. The hum on the radio stopped abruptly, and a voice began to recite a series of 6-digit geographic coordinates. Gideon grabbed a notepad from the glove box and started writing down the numbers as they were spoken by the voice. He looked at his topographic map and realized the coordinates were pointing to a location exactly 2 miles ahead of him. The mechanic put the truck in gear and slowly drove toward the coordinates while the voice continued to repeat the numbers. He rounded a sharp corner and saw a silver utility van parked in the middle of the narrow and snowy road. The van was covered in a thick layer of frost and appeared to have been sitting in the pass for weeks. Gideon stopped his truck and walked toward the vehicle with a sense of caution that he had developed over many years. He looked through the passenger window and saw that the interior of the van was completely stripped of its original seats. The back of the van was filled with large racks of recording equipment that were glowing with soft green and blue lights. Gideon noticed a heavy black cable running from the van into a deep hole that had been drilled into the rock. He followed the cable to the edge of the cliff and saw that it descended into the dark and foggy canyon. A sudden movement in the driver's seat made him jump back and reach for the heavy flashlight on his work belt. The man in the driver's seat was wearing a thick parka and held a radio microphone in his gloved right hand. Gideon knocked on the glass and asked the man if he needed any help with his vehicle or his radio gear. The man did not move or blink his eyes as he continued to stare straight ahead at the snowy mountain peaks. Gideon opened the door and realized that the figure in the seat was not a person, but a lifelike plastic mannequin. He felt a wave of confusion wash over him as he looked at the intricate wiring connected to the mannequin's head. The recording equipment in the back of the van started to spin, and a high-pitched squeal filled the small space. Gideon reached for the main power switch to stop the noise, but the metal casing was too hot to touch safely. He heard his own voice coming from the speakers in the van describing his departure from the cabin that very morning. The recording was playing back the exact words he had spoken to the dispatcher only 3 hours earlier in the day. He scrambled out of the van and ran back to his truck as the wind began to howl through the pass. Gideon grabbed his radio and tried to call the base station to report the strange vehicle and the automated recording gear. The radio in his truck was dead, and the display screen was cracked as if it had been hit with force. He looked at the silver van and saw that the lights inside were now flashing in a rapid and erratic pattern. Gideon slammed the truck into reverse and backed away from the site until he found a spot wide enough to turn. He drove down the mountain at a dangerous speed and did not stop until he reached the ranger station at the base. The mechanic ran inside and told the duty officer that there was a strange van broadcasting private signals at the summit. The ranger looked at the logs and told Gideon that the road had been closed for 3 days due to ice. The ranger agreed to follow Gideon back up the mountain pass to see the vehicle and the suspicious electronic recording equipment. They drove for an hour through the deepening snow, but they found the road to be completely empty and undisturbed ahead. There were no tire tracks in the fresh powder, and the silver utility van was nowhere to be found near the cliff. Gideon showed the officer the spot where he had parked, but the snow was smooth and white without any marks. They walked to the edge of the cliff, but there was no hole in the rock and no black cable. The ranger told Gideon that the thin air and the cold must have caused him to experience a brief hallucination. Gideon reached into his pocket to find the notepad with the coordinates he had written down during the strange radio event. The paper was in his hand, but the ink had faded into a series of blurry gray smudges that were illegible. He tried to explain that he had heard his own voice on the recording, but the ranger was already walking away. Gideon went home and sat in his quiet cabin while he listened to the silence of the woods outside his window. He turned on his home radio and searched the frequencies until he found the channel he had used that cold morning. There was nothing but the sound of the wind and the faint tapping of a metal pipe against a heavy frame. He realized that the coordinates he had followed were not for a physical location, but for a specific point in time. Gideon never returned to the mountain pass and sold his truck to a local scrapyard a few weeks after that. The cellular company investigated the battery failure at the summit and found that the equipment was in perfect working order. No silver van was ever registered in the county, and no reports of missing mannequins were filed with the state police. The records from that day were filed under miscellaneous interference and were eventually destroyed to make room for new digital files. Gideon Vance lived the rest of his life in the valley and never spoke of the mountain pass to anyone again. Some things that happen in the high country are meant to stay there among the rocks in the freezing winter air. The final radio check from that day remains a mystery that the wilderness has chosen to keep for itself forever. The missing tape, found inside an abandoned ranger station. In the late summer of 1984, a local hiking group discovered a small cabin hidden deep within the woods. The structure served as an old ranger station that the forestry department had officially decommissioned over 30 years before that day. Inside the dusty main room, they found a single magnetic tape sitting on a desk next to an empty lantern. The reel was thick with grime and appeared to have been untouched since the mid-20th century was still in its prime. Silas Vance was a 32-year-old land surveyor who spent most of his weeks mapping the rugged terrain. He arrived at the trailhead early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of marking the western boundary lines. The weather was unusually clear for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his work before the sunset. He carried a heavy pack filled with surveying tools and a large thermos of coffee to keep his energy levels high. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp pine needles and ancient decaying wood. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of pine trees, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of a wooden fence. He followed the timberline until he saw the silhouette of a small building perched on a rocky limestone ledge. The windows were boarded up with gray planks, and the front door hung slightly open on its rusted iron hinges. Silas stepped onto the porch and felt the floorboards groan under his weight as he moved toward the dark interior. He noticed that the structural integrity of the cabin was failing as the roof sagged under the weight of moss. He pushed the door open and noticed a strange scent of old paper and copper hanging heavy in the air. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, but the desk in the center of the room looked surprisingly clean. Silas approached the desk and saw a reel-to-reel tape recorder sitting ready as if someone just stepped away. He found a small black cassette tape resting beside the machine with a handwritten label that simply said August 4th. The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a hand that was shaking with fear. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific station was a man named Elias Thorne in 1950. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his weekly radio check-ins without any prior warning. Search teams combed the surrounding hills for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing Forest Service employee. Silas picked up the tape and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire building. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man named Elias. The surveyor decided to bring the tape back to his office to see if the recorded audio contained any clues. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back to his truck while the sun began to dip below the horizon. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to hear the voice of the man who had vanished so long ago. He drove home in silence and immediately began searching for a compatible player to listen to the old magnetic reel. The town was quiet as he passed through the main street and noticed the flickering lights of the old theater. Silas eventually found a working player at a local thrift store and connected it to his desk speakers that evening. He pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy door closing. A voice that sounded tired and strained began to speak about a series of lights appearing in the northern valley. The man on the recording claimed that the lights were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft. He spoke with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer of the natural mountain world. The narrator described how the lights would hover over the tree line for hours before disappearing into the deep mountain lakes. Witness statements from 1950 mentioned similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oak Haven during that same summer. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the floorboards of the station. He believed that something was living beneath the cabin and was using the radio antenna to broadcast a strange signal. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass jars on the shelves to vibrate and crack. Silas listened closely as the recording captured the sound of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the ranger station. Elias stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the heavy breathing of a man. The ranger whispered that he could see eyes reflecting the moonlight through the gaps in the wooden boards of the door. He claimed that the visitors were not from the town, and they did not look like any animals he knew. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the shingles on the roof with great speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from isolation and wandered off. However, the details on the tape suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his safety. Silas paused the audio and looked at the date on the tape, which was the day before Elias went missing. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the tapping on the recording was getting much louder. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the ancient wood of the isolated mountain station. The final few minutes of the audio contained a frantic description of the cabin being surrounded by a bright blue light. Elias shouted that the humming sound was vibrating the glass in the windows and making his ears bleed from the pressure. He mentioned that he was going to hide the tape in the desk and hoped that someone would eventually find it. The recording ended abruptly with a loud metallic crash and the sound of the wind rushing through the open station. Silence filled the room of Silas as the tape continued to spin without any more recorded sound or voices. Silas contacted the local historical society the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the abandoned woods. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the tape and confirmed that the voice matched the old radio logs of Elias Thorne. They returned to the site of the ranger station together to look for the hidden compartment Elias mentioned on the tape. The forest seemed different under the morning light, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their minds. They found a small metal box buried under the floorboards that contained a series of photographs and a silver ring. The photographs showed blurry images of metallic objects hovering over the very trees Silas had walked through just the day before. One image captured a tall figure standing in the shadows of the porch with elongated limbs and very large dark eyes. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any language. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply disappeared, but had been documenting an encounter that defies any logical explanation. The symbols on the ring seemed to glow faintly when the men brought it into the direct sunlight. The authorities reopened the case, but the physical evidence remained the only proof of what happened on that August night. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger station and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for others. The tape serves as a haunting reminder that some mysteries are buried in the woods for a very good reason. He no longer surveys that section of the forest because the low humming sound still echoes in his quiet dreams. The station remains empty and forgotten by most, but the tape still holds the secrets of 1950. Every time Silas looks at the jagged peaks of the mountains, he remembers the frantic voice of the lost forest ranger. He kept a copy of the tape in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to play the audio. The researcher Marcus Reed moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring again. Local legends continue to grow about the station on the limestone ledge and the lights that still appear in the valley. Silas knows that the truth is recorded on that thin magnetic strip hidden inside the drawer of his wooden desk. This roadside camera captured something nobody noticed. The long and winding stretch of asphalt known as Route 42 cut a lonely path through the dense pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. For miles in every direction, the landscape was dominated by ancient cedar trees and thick undergrowth that swallowed the morning light. A single automated traffic camera sat perched atop a weathered steel pole near the remote boundary of a massive state park. This specific device was programmed to take a high-resolution photograph every 60 seconds to monitor seasonal weather and road conditions. Local transportation officials rarely checked the digital archives unless a significant accident or a major storm was reported in the area. On a Tuesday in October of 2021, the camera recorded a sequence of images that seemed entirely ordinary to any casual observer. Silas Thorne was a 34-year-old maintenance technician who worked for the Regional Department of Transportation during that year. His primary job involved traveling to remote locations to ensure that solar panels and data transmitters were functioning within normal parameters. Silas enjoyed the solitude of his work because it allowed him to explore the rugged landscape far from the city noise. He was a man of habit who took pride in the technical precision required to keep the remote monitoring network alive. On that particular morning, he received a notification that a specific camera unit was experiencing a strange, recurring storage error. He packed his tools into his white utility truck and began the long drive toward the isolated mountain pass corridor. The drive took nearly 3 hours as the elevation climbed and the fog hung low over the dense canopy of trees. Silas reached the base of the pole and connected his rugged laptop to the diagnostic port located inside the metal box. He noticed that the hard drive was almost full of temporary files that should have been deleted automatically every month. The system was lagging because it was struggling to process a series of photographs taken during a recent heavy rainstorm. Silas decided to download the final batch of images before he cleared the memory and reset the internal software. He wanted to make sure the optical sensor had not been damaged by the moisture or the high winds. As the progress bar moved across his screen, he scrolled through the thumbnails to ensure the lens was still properly focused. He saw the familiar gray pavement and the blurred shapes of passing cars that moved through the frame at high speeds. One image from 3 nights prior caught his eye because the background lighting looked different from the photos around it. A small white sedan was parked on the narrow shoulder of the road just past the edge of the guardrail. The car had its hazard lights on, and the driver's side door was left standing wide open toward the forest. It was an odd place to stop because the terrain was steep and there were no trails in sight. Silas felt a slight chill because that section of the highway was known for having absolutely no cellular phone service. He clicked on the next photo in the sequence to see if the driver was standing near the vehicle for help. The white sedan was still there, but the open door was now closed and a dark figure stood near the trunk. The figure appeared to be reaching into the dense brush, and they were pulling something heavy out from the shadows. Silas zoomed in on the grainy pixels until he could see the silhouette of a large and dusty camping trunk. The person in the photo was wearing a dark hooded jacket that obscured their face from the camera lens. He checked the timestamps and realized that the person had been at that specific location for less than 4 minutes. The third photo showed the white sedan pulling back onto the asphalt and leaving nothing but tire tracks in the mud. Silas looked toward the actual spot on the shoulder and saw that the grass was still flattened near the trees. He felt a strange urge to investigate the area, even though his primary task for the day was already finished. He stepped over the metal guardrail and walked toward the exact place where the figure had stood in the photograph. The air was cold, and the only sound was the wind whistling through the high branches of the pines. The ground was soft from the recent rains, and he noticed deep gouges in the earth where something had been dragged. He followed the trail for about 50 feet until he reached a small clearing hidden behind a thicket of ferns. Silas found the camping trunk tucked under a pile of damp pine needles and heavy branches that looked intentionally placed. He reached down to touch the cold plastic surface and saw that the heavy latches were sealed with industrial tape. A faint smell of metallic decay hung in the stagnant air, and Silas immediately pulled his hand back in realization. He knew that he should not open the container without the proper authorities present at the scene. He used his radio to contact the dispatch office and reported that he had discovered a suspicious item in the woods. Within an hour, 2 state troopers arrived at the scene and began to secure the perimeter with yellow plastic tape. They asked Silas to show them the photographs on his laptop so they could identify the make and the model. The officers noted that the white sedan did not have a visible rear license plate in any frame. They carefully cut the tape on the trunk and discovered several stolen historical artifacts from a local museum storage facility. These were items that had been missing for months following a sophisticated heist that left no physical evidence behind. The museum had reported a quiet break in 3 months earlier, but the investigators had no leads on the items. These artifacts were extremely valuable, and the thieves had likely hidden them in the forest until the heat died down. The police realized the driver must have returned to the woods to move the cache to a more permanent location. They analyzed the road camera data from other units along the highway to track the path of the white sedan. This lead eventually took them to a small rental property located 2 towns over from the edge of the park. They found the vehicle hidden in a detached garage behind a row of tall hedges and overgrown weeds. Inside the house, the authorities found more items that had been taken during the same heist earlier that same year. The suspects had been living there under false names while they waited for a buyer to finalize a secret purchase. One of the men was a former security guard who knew exactly how to avoid the primary surveillance systems. He did not realize that the remote traffic camera was set to trigger every minute, regardless of any motion. His simple mistake of parking in that specific spot had provided the only evidence needed to solve the case. The archives of the transportation department had captured the one moment he thought was completely private. Silas returned to his office that afternoon and felt a sense of pride for paying attention to the small details. Most people would have deleted the corrupted files without looking at the images because it was a routine maintenance job. The state park was now safe from the looters, and the historical treasures were returned to their rightful display cases. He continued his work across the mountains and always looked a little closer at the photos from the lonely road. Sometimes, the most important things are hidden in the background of a world that is always moving fast. The quiet technician had become an accidental hero by simply doing his job with a watchful eye. The automated camera still stands on its steel pole and records the passage of time one frame at a time. It captures the fog and the trees and the occasional car that travels through the silence of the woods. No one ever suspects that a simple machine could be the most important witness to a crime in the wilderness. Silas knows that every photograph tells a story if someone is willing to take the time to look. He drives the highway with a new perspective and watches the shadows for anything else the lens might catch. The forest remains vast and mysterious, but it is no longer a place where secrets can stay hidden forever. What happened in this roadside motel was never reported. Local police files from 1996 contain a series of strange reports about a motel on Highway 8. Most of these official documents were never released to the public because the findings were considered too strange for print. Lyle Thorne was a 42-year-old insurance investigator who specialized in finding high-value missing property. He spent most of his life driving through rural counties and staying in places that most people would usually avoid. One rainy Tuesday in October, he was looking for a place to rest after a long day of tedious work. The Sunnyside Inn sat on a quiet stretch of road that felt far away from any major town or city. Lyle pulled his sedan into the gravel lot and noticed that the neon sign was flickering in the dark woods. There were only 2 other cars parked in front of the long row of identical blue doors near the office. He checked into room 14 and paid the elderly man at the desk with $20 in crisp cash. The room smelled like old cedar and industrial cleaner, which was common for these types of cheap roadside lodging houses. Lyle set his briefcase on the desk and decided to record his daily notes before he went to sleep tonight. He turned on his portable tape recorder and started describing the mundane details of his latest insurance claim in the city. A sharp, metallic scratching sound coming from behind the wall made him stop talking in the middle of a sentence. He looked at the thin floral wallpaper and realized the sound was moving slowly from the ceiling toward the floor. Lyle walked over to the wall and pressed his ear against the cold surface to hear what was happening inside. He heard a soft, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a heavy heart beating against the wooden frame of the building. The investigator decided to walk outside to see if there was any maintenance work being done on the exterior wall. The gravel lot was completely empty, and the 2 cars he saw earlier were now gone without making any sound. He looked at the window of room 15 next door, but the heavy curtains were shut tight against the night. Lyle walked back into his room and noticed that his tape recorder was still running on the small wooden desk. He picked up the device and rewound the tape to see if the scratching sound had been caught on audio. When he pressed play, he did not hear his own voice or the scratching sounds from the thin motel walls. Instead, he heard a recording of a man and a woman having a very quiet conversation about a hidden basement. The voices on the tape sounded like they were standing right next to the microphone in the empty motel room. Lyle checked the recorder for any signs of tampering, but the device was exactly where he had left it earlier. He knew that his recorder had not been out of his sight since he entered the Sunnyside Inn that evening. The woman on the tape mentioned that the floorboards in room 14 were the only way to reach the stairs. Lyle looked down at the stained brown carpet and felt a chill go down his spine in the quiet room. He moved the heavy desk aside and peeled back a corner of the carpet to see what was underneath it. There was a small brass ring attached to a square piece of plywood that had been cut into the floor. He pulled the ring, and the wooden hatch opened with a loud groan that echoed through the small guest room. A narrow set of concrete stairs led down into a dark space that was not visible from the outside. Lyle grabbed his heavy flashlight from his briefcase and began to climb down into the hidden area beneath the motel. The air in the basement was cold and dry, which felt very different from the humid October air outside. He shone his light around the room and saw shelves filled with hundreds of small black boxes and white envelopes. Each box had a date and a room number written on the side in faded black ink from past years. Lyle reached for a box labeled 1984 and found a collection of personal items and Polaroid photos inside. There were driver licenses and wedding rings and small toys that looked like they belonged to families who stayed here. He realized that none of these items were mentioned in any of the local police reports he had ever read. He found a ledger on a nearby table that listed names of guests next to a column titled Final Status. Most of the entries in the ledger ended with the word processed, which made Lyle feel a deep sense of dread. He heard the sound of the blue door to room 14 opening directly above his head in the quiet motel. Lyle turned off his flashlight and crouched behind a stack of wooden crates to stay hidden in the thick darkness. He heard heavy footsteps walking across the floorboards and then the sound of the carpet being pulled back again. A bright beam of light shot down into the basement as the elderly manager peered into the dark square hole. The manager was holding a long iron bar, and he started to climb down the concrete stairs with slow movements. Lyle saw the man stop at the bottom of the stairs and look directly toward the crates where he was hiding. The manager whispered that he knew someone was down there because the ledger had been moved from its original spot. Lyle waited until the man turned his back, and then he bolted for the stairs with every ounce of energy. He scrambled up the concrete steps and pushed past the manager, who tried to grab his leg in the dark. Lyle reached the guest room and ran out the front door into the pouring rain without looking back at all. He jumped into his car and drove toward the nearest town until he found a gas station with bright lights. He called the county sheriff from a payphone and explained that he had found a hidden room at the motel. The sheriff arrived 30 minutes later and followed Lyle back to the Sunnyside Inn to investigate the strange hidden basement. When they arrived at the property, they found that the gravel lot was empty and the neon sign was dark. The office was locked and the manager was nowhere to be found when the sheriff knocked loudly on the door. They entered room 14 and pulled back the brown carpet, but they found nothing but solid subflooring and old nails. There was no brass ring and no wooden hatch and no sign that a hidden basement had ever existed there. The sheriff looked at Lyle with a look of deep suspicion and asked if he had been drinking that night. Lyle pulled the small black box from his jacket pocket to show the officer the evidence he had taken earlier. He opened the box, but instead of jewelry or photos, it was filled with nothing but gray dust and dirt. The sheriff told Lyle to go home and get some rest before he decided to file a false report charge. Lyle drove away, but he kept the tape recorder in the passenger seat as he headed toward the next city. He pressed play on the device to hear the mysterious voices one last time before he reached his own house. The tape was completely silent for several minutes until a new voice started speaking at a very low volume level. It was his own voice, but it was describing the basement and the ledger in the past tense, like history. The recording ended with the sound of a heavy wooden hatch closing and a brass ring hitting the floorboards softly. Lyle looked in his rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights following him at a very long distance behind. He realized that the things he saw in the motel were never meant to be reported to the local authorities. The Sunnyside Inn was torn down 2 years later to make room for a new highway expansion through the county. Construction crews found nothing unusual in the soil, and no records of a basement were found in the city archives. Lyle Thorne moved to another state and stopped working as an insurance investigator shortly after that strange night in October. He never stayed in a roadside motel again for the rest of his life because he feared the walls. Some stories are better left in the dark where they cannot be proven or recorded by the light of day. The truth about Room 14 remains buried under miles of hot black asphalt and the silence of the deep woods. What happened inside this winter motel still haunts police. The discovery of a frozen guest log beneath the floorboards of a demolished building changed the history of a small town. A construction worker found the leather book while clearing debris from a winter motel that had been closed for decades. The pages were damp, but the ink remained legible enough to reveal a series of names that never officially checked out. It contained a final entry from a traveler who seemed to document a very strange event before vanishing into the night. Silas Vance was a 45-year-old insurance investigator who spent his days traveling between the quiet and snowy towns. He arrived at the motel early on a Tuesday evening with the simple goal of resting before his morning meeting. The weather was unusually cold for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his paperwork in the warm room. He carried a heavy briefcase and a small portable radio to keep him company during the long and silent winter night. The air was dry, and the building felt heavy with the scent of old carpet and stale smoke that lingered. As Silas parked his car in front of room 12, he noticed a series of strange markings on the doorframe. He followed the grain of the wood with his fingers until he felt a deep vibration coming from the door. The investigator stepped inside the room and noticed that the furniture was arranged in a pattern that made no sense. He moved toward the desk and found a small handwritten note tucked under the base of the plastic bedside lamp. The note was dated August 10, 1972, and it warned the reader not to turn off the lights. He sat on the bed, and the internal silence of the room was broken by a soft humming from the walls. A thick layer of frost began to form on the window, even though the heater was running at full power. Silas reached for his radio to find a music station, but only a rhythmic clicking came through the small speaker. He found a ledger in the drawer and noticed that the last guest had written about a shadow in corner. The handwriting was jagged and suggested that the person was feeling a sudden sense of physical dread or deep fear. According to local archives, the area where the motel stood had been the site of several missing person cases before. Dispatch logs from that decade indicate that multiple guests reported seeing figures that stood perfectly still in the parking lot. Search teams arrived at the property 4 days after Silas was reported missing, but found no signs of any struggle. They found his car parked in the exact same spot, but the interior was filled with a fine white sand. Silas left his briefcase on the bed, and it was the only piece of property that had a note. The investigator had decided to keep a log of the sounds he heard through the thin walls of the unit. He spent the last few minutes of his recorded time staring at the door while the clicking sound grew louder. Silas felt a strange sense of curiosity and stepped toward the bathroom to investigate a bright light under the door. He walked toward the glowing crack and disappeared from the main room as the humming reached a very high pitch. The town was quiet when the developers finally found the hidden ledger during the demolition process many long years later. The authorities eventually found a working player and listened to the final 30 minutes of the tape Silas had made. They pressed the play button and heard a soft hiss of static, followed by the sound of a heavy latch. A voice that sounded distant and distorted began to overlap with the audio of the wind blowing through the snow. The figure in the room moved with a fluid motion that did not match the gait of a human being. He spoke with a level of urgency that suggested he was trying to warn the next guest about the light. The recording described how a large shadow would move across the ceiling, even when the lamp was turned toward wall. Witness statements from 1972 mention similar shadows being seen by a group of travelers in the same sector. Silas Vance reported that he had started feeling a heavy pressure in his head as the clicking sound moved closer. He believed that something was projecting a frequency that was intended to keep him from leaving the room that night. The pressure was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass of the mirror to develop a network of cracks. The investigators listened closely as the recording captured the sound of heavy scratching against the exterior bricks of motel. Silas stopped speaking for several seconds, and the only sound on the tape was the rapid clicking of a mechanism. The investigator whispered that he could see a tall shape standing just beyond the reach of the outdoor sign. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for the power to fail so the room would be in total darkness. The scratching was persistent and moved from the windows up to the roof with a very terrifying mechanical precision. The investigation into the disappearance of Silas Vance had originally concluded that he likely walked into the snow and lost. However, the details in the ledger suggested that the investigator was being actively watched by something that understood his routine. The sheriff paused the tape and looked at the timestamp, which showed that the recording stopped at exactly midnight. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the clicking on the tape matched the rhythm of breathing. The sound was sharp and sounded like bone striking against the wooden frame of the door in the room. The final few seconds of the audio contained a frantic description of the room being filled with a blue light. Silas shouted that the humming sound was vibrating his teeth and making his ears bleed from the sheer physical pressure. He mentioned that he was going to try and hide the ledger so that someone would eventually find the truth. The recording ended abruptly with a bright flash of white light and the sound of the radio being crushed shut. Silence filled the room of the station as the tape stopped without any more images of the desert or... The sheriff contacted the state archives the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the motel site. A technician named Marcus Reed examined the ledger and confirmed that the ink matched the supplies used in '72. They returned to the site of the ruins together to look for the briefcase Silas mentioned in his final words. The desert seemed empty under the afternoon sun, but the feeling of being watched remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal box buried in the foundation that contained a series of sketches and a watch. The sketches showed detailed drawings of a craft that looked like a polished stone floating just above the motel roof. One image captured a figure standing in the doorway of room 12 with glowing patterns etched into its gray skin. Marcus noted that the silver watch had a residue on it that glowed when exposed to an ultraviolet light. They realized that Silas Vance had not simply wandered off, but had been documenting a presence that was very ancient. The patterns on the sketches seemed to shift when the men looked at them from a different angle in light. The authorities closed the case officially, but the ledger remains in a high-security evidence locker at the county office. The family of Silas Vance often thinks about the quiet investigator and the warning he tried to leave behind. The book serves as a haunting reminder that the winter holds secrets that are better left undisturbed by the living. He no longer explores the old roadside buildings because the clicking sound still echoes in the back of his. The site remains empty and avoided by locals, but the ledger still holds the final warning of 1970. Every time Marcus drives past the empty lot, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost man on the page. He kept a copy of the report in a safe place, but he rarely has the courage to read. The researcher Marcus Reed moved away shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver watch again. Local legends continue to grow about the motel room and the lights that still appear over the snow floor. Silas knew that the truth was recorded on that small ledger hidden under the boards of the old room. Today, the highway is monitored by new systems that do not require a man to stop at a motel today. The lot is covered with winter snow, and the state has removed the old signs from the high desert sector. Silas Vance spends his time working in the city where the lights keep the shadows away from the windows. He still wonders if the clicking sound he heard on the tape was a message or just the sound. The winter wind continues to blow snow against the ruins, while the memory of the investigator fades into local history. The road goes on forever, but some travelers never reach the end of the line because of the motel lights. Keep your eyes on the road and do not look too long into the shadows of the high winter night. The truth is there, but it is hidden in the static and the clicking of the old magnetic tapes recorded. Silas Vance knows this, and that is why his voice stays in the ledger where the words never truly fade. The snow is waiting for the next traveler to pull over and listen to the humming in the air. The archived records of the local police department show that the original investigators were deeply unsettled by the evidence found. Many of them resigned within a year of the search and refused to speak about the details of Room 12. They reportedly felt a lingering coldness that no amount of heating could fix even in the middle of the summer. The case of Silas Vance remains one of the most chilling, unexplained mysteries in the history of the mountain pass. His voice on the tape continues to remind us that some winter nights are far longer than the calendar says. In this new story, archived winter summaries across several mountain districts mention a cluster of December disappearances that occurred in remote forest corridors during severe cold snaps. None of the cases shared confirmed connections, yet the patterns unsettled investigators because each incident involved travelers who vanished within narrow windows of time and distance. Locals across distant counties traded similar warnings about isolated routes that turned unpredictable once deep winter settled over the landscape. Maeve Corbin, a 35-year-old contract cartographer, drove into one of those regions during early December while updating wildfire access maps before heavy storms closed the mountain roads. Her assignment required photographing trail markers, verifying creek crossings, and checking outdated maintenance routes. She expected a calm day because forecasts predicted only light snow with no major wind. She carried her camera bag, a roll of updated charts, and a small thermos she rarely traveled without. The forest road twisted between steep ridges where the sky looked pale and flat. Patches of ice crept across the asphalt, which forced her to reduce speed. She passed a faded sign warning that plows rarely reached beyond the next junction. A second sign hung loosely along a bent post announcing road closures from mid-month onward. She knew officials planned to block the route soon, but she needed one final survey before seasonal shutdown. After an hour, she reached a narrow turnout where a wooden information board leaned forward as if pushed by years of storms. She stepped out to photograph the area and noticed several footprints leading toward a slope behind the turnout. The prints appeared fresh, which surprised her because no vehicles had passed during her entire drive. She followed the tracks for several yards before they disappeared into a cluster of spruce where snow thickened unexpectedly. Maeve returned to her truck just as wind brushed across the ridge. She climbed back in, warmed her hands near the heater, and drove deeper along the route until she reached a rusted trail gate chained open for winter access. Beyond it, the trees grew denser while the road narrowed. She stopped again when she spotted a small backpack lying upright near a drainage ditch. The sight made her uneasy because the pack looked recently dropped. She examined the backpack carefully. Inside, she found a half-frozen water bottle, an outdated trail map, and a name tag belonging to someone who reportedly passed through the region earlier that week. Local bulletins had mentioned a hiker who turned back during a sudden snow squall, then never returned to town. The match between the name and the story sent a chill through her despite the insulated gloves she wore. She wrote the coordinates in her notebook, then scanned the surrounding woods. Snow fell lightly, which muted the forest until everything felt distant. Wind carried faint creaks from trees shifting under frost. She called out, "Anyone here?" even knowing the chances of hearing a reply were low. Her voice vanished into the branches almost instantly. As she prepared to leave the area, she noticed a strip of reflective tape fixed high on a pine trunk. The tape looked newer than the map in the backpack, which puzzled her because crews rarely mark trees during winter. She photographed the tape, then moved closer to investigate. Behind the trunk, she found a narrow footpath nearly hidden under fresh snow. The path sloped downward toward a shallow ravine. Maeve followed it only briefly because she wanted to finish her official survey before exploring more. She drove another mile until the road opened into a broad meadow where the wind carried powder across the ground in thin streams. The sky darkened earlier than expected, which hinted at an incoming front. She stopped near an old ranger's shed leaning crookedly against a boulder. The door hung half open as if someone entered recently. Inside, she discovered a battered notebook full of field notes from a ranger patrol several years earlier. The writer described multiple strange findings across the region, including abandoned campsites, missing equipment caches, and faint tracks that vanished mid-trail. One entry mentioned hearing rhythmic knocks in a valley that appeared empty at the time. Another referred to sudden temperature drops in sheltered areas that normally stayed warm due to thick tree coverage. A gust of wind pushed snow into the shed, which made her step outside. She noticed a distant flash of movement between the tree line and the meadow. It looked like someone crossing the clearing quickly. She called out again, but received no answer. She recorded the direction in her notes because the movement matched earlier reports about people seen shortly before storms swept through. She returned to her truck and continued along the route until she reached a steep descent toward a river crossing. The radio crackled with faint static as she drove into the low ground. The river froze early this year, which formed jagged ridges of ice near the bank. She parked near the bridge, which creaked under layers of frost. The scene felt isolated enough to raise her vigilance. She scanned the area and saw a small pile of orange fabric caught in a brush cluster. She approached and found a torn piece of a high-visibility jacket. The fabric pattern matched gear often used by volunteer search teams. She collected the fragment, sealed it in a small evidence pouch, and wrote the discovery in her notebook. A trail of shallow footprints stretched from the fabric toward the riverbank, then curved sharply uphill toward dense vegetation. Maeve followed the trail, which led to an open section of forest where trees grew in uneven clusters. The air felt colder here, even though the wind paused briefly. She heard a faint, repetitive sound that resembled metal shifting. The pattern echoed irregularly, which made her wonder if it came from old equipment hidden somewhere beneath the snow. She swept her flashlight across the branches and noticed more reflective tape placed higher than typical trail markers. She recorded the placements, which formed a rough arc around the clearing. The arrangement looked intentional rather than random. She moved farther into the trees and found a narrow ravine where the snowpack appeared disturbed. Several sets of tracks converged into the ravine, though none continued beyond it. It looked as if multiple individuals descended the ravine, yet never climbed out. She crouched to examine the slope and noticed faint indentations almost hidden beneath the surface. They resembled pressure marks left by equipment pulled along the ground. She brushed away a patch of snow and revealed a rusted metal rung embedded into the soil. The rung looked like part of an old ascent ladder used during past forestry projects. She tugged on it lightly and felt a hollow space beneath. Her pulse quickened as she realized a buried structure might exist under the ravine. Old industrial tunnels or storm shelters sometimes collapsed, then filled with soil and ice. She considered climbing down for a clearer look, but the ground felt unstable. A deep vibration traveled through the slope, which convinced her to back away. The vibration lasted several seconds, then faded like a distant machine shutting down. She returned to her truck and drove toward a higher junction where she could regain radio contact. However, the snow thickened into a white curtain, which limited visibility to a few yards. The approaching storm arrived earlier than predicted, which forced her to stop near a rock outcrop. She checked her maps and found an old maintenance spur branching off the main route. She considered waiting the storm out inside her truck, but the wind intensified until the vehicle rocked gently. She turned onto the spur, hoping to reach a sheltered runoff area. Halfway up the incline, she saw a flickering light near a line of trees. The light pulsed slowly as if signaling through heavy snowfall. She thought it might be a lost hiker or a stranded motorist, so she parked and stepped out with her flashlight raised high. She moved closer and saw the light belonged to a small lantern hanging from a branch. The lantern's flame flickered erratically despite the wind. Beneath it, a message scratched into bark read, "Shelter Line West, Trail 2." She took a picture of the message because the direction did not match any current maps. Before she could investigate further, she heard another vibration behind her. This time, the sound clearly resembled metal scraping across stone. She turned to see a dark outline shift along the ridge, though the storm blurred the details. The shape moved slowly, then vanished behind a curtain of snow. She backed toward her truck, but stopped when she noticed another set of footprints near the lantern. The steps looked fresher than those near the ravine, which meant someone recently walked this route during the worsening storm. Maeve followed the footprints along the spur, which led her to an exposed slope overlooking a deep bowl-shaped corridor. The wind calmed momentarily, which gave her a clear view of the valley floor. She saw multiple patterns carved into the snow, which resembled rows of long trenches or paths created by dragging equipment. At the far end of the bowl, a faint orange glow flickered near the base of a cliff. She zoomed in with her camera and captured several photos. The glow pulsed in a steady sequence, which reminded her of security beacons or signal flares. She lowered the camera as another vibration traveled through the ground. Snow along the slope shifted slightly, which convinced her to retreat before a slide occurred. She drove back toward the main route and reached a narrow ridge where the wind finally eased enough for her to regain partial radio contact. She relayed her findings to a dispatch operator who promised to send search teams when conditions improved. She continued toward the junction when she saw a lone figure standing near a marker post. She slowed her vehicle and opened the window to call out, but the figure turned and walked toward a thicket without responding. She parked and followed on foot with her flashlight directed forward. The figure disappeared behind clusters of fir trees which bent under the weight of snow. She searched the area for several minutes until she found a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The material matched the torn jacket found near the river, which meant she followed the same person or someone wearing similar gear. She marked the area on her map and returned to her truck as the storm thickened again. By the time she reached town, she felt exhausted from navigating through swirling ice and limited visibility. She handed her notes and photographs to local authorities who launched a coordinated search involving multiple teams. Over the next days, crews uncovered signs of old subterranean structures near the ravine and discovered collapsed ventilation shafts hidden under decades of soil. They found fragments of cold-weather clothing near one shaft, which suggested at least one traveler entered the area recently. Searchers also found pieces of rusted metal aligned in patterns that matched the long trenches Maeve captured in her photos. Engineers believed the structures belonged to a decades-old survey project abandoned after repeated cave-ins and safety violations. Thick snowfall and unstable terrain hid the remains until small shifts exposed parts during recent storms. Despite extensive searches, none of the recent missing individuals were recovered. Their tracks led toward the ravine, then vanished. Officials installed warning signs along the entire route and restricted access to the bowl-shaped corridor where the vibrations continued intermittently throughout the season. Acoustic equipment detected low-frequency pulses beneath the ground, though investigators could not confirm their source. Maeve continued her mapping work for the region but avoided the specific corridor after her report. She believed the December disappearances connected to the unstable subsurface network and shifting snow patterns that revealed and concealed pathways unpredictably. She often thought about the lantern hanging from the tree and the carved message pointing toward a shelter line no longer marked on any map. Locals still warn travelers each December about remote areas with unexplained vibrations and old structures hidden under winter snow. They recount stories about lights flickering near forgotten corridors and figures moving between trees just before storms intensify. Each tale differs slightly, yet the core remains the same. Some December nights, the forest feels alive with echoes of routes built long before current maps existed. And sometimes footsteps lead into valleys where wind and snow erase each trace within minutes, leaving only cold silence across remote America. In this news story, archived winter case summaries mention an isolated roadside motel where a handful of January incidents reportedly ended with rooms found locked from the inside. None of the events led to confirmed criminal findings, yet each file contained similar details about strange audio interference and abrupt temperature drops moments before contact with occupants was lost. The building still stands near a quiet state route where storms form quickly in midwinter. Elias Trenton, a 36-year-old traveling survey technician, checked into that motel during a frigid January evening after his truck lost traction near a frozen incline. He planned to spend one night there before continuing toward a mountain utility site the next morning. The motel looked worn but serviceable, a flat row of rooms facing a snow-covered parking lot where sodium lights flickered through the cold. He carried 2 duffel bags, his company tablet, and an old camcorder he used to document cabin inspections when cell reception dropped. The lobby door chimed weakly as he entered. The desk sat empty except for a sign explaining that late arrivals should ring the bell. Before he touched it, a woman emerged from the back room, wrapped in a thick sweater, hair still wet from the snow outside. She checked him in quickly and handed him a key to room 6. She warned him that heavy wind sometimes rattled the doors during storms, which caused guests to think someone knocked when no one stood outside. He nodded politely, then headed back into the cold to unload his gear. The motel hallway felt warmer than the exterior, yet still carried a draft that slipped through gaps near the window frames. He unlocked room 6 and stepped inside. The space smelled faintly of old carpet cleaner mixed with dry heat from the wall unit. A small table stood near the door where he placed his camcorder and notebook. Outside the window, snow drifted past the lights in slow waves. Elias recorded a quick video note for his employer, describing road conditions and slight delays. The camcorder picked up the hum of the heater and occasional rattling from the air vent. He checked the lock twice because the door mechanism felt loose. After settling in, he heated water for a packet of instant noodles and reviewed maps for the next day's assignment. The storm outside intensified until patterns of white spiraled across the glass. He attempted a radio check with a colleague at the ridge station, but heard only static layered with faint, irregular clicks. The storm likely disrupted all nearby channels. He made a note to attempt another call before sleeping. As he prepared to shut off the overhead light, he heard a soft tap at the door. He froze. The tap repeated once, then stopped. He approached carefully and looked through the peephole. Nothing moved outside except snow swirling across the walkway. He waited several minutes before returning to the bed. The heater clicked loudly as it cycled off. The room dimmed under the single lamp beside the table. The camcorder remained on standby, its indicator light reflecting faintly on the wall. He planned to sleep early, yet another sound reached him, a scraping near the bathroom vent. It resembled metal sliding against metal in short, inconsistent strokes. Elias stepped into the bathroom and turned on the light. The vent cover rattled slightly when he tapped it. Cold air drifted out as if the duct connected to an exterior shaft. He bent down to listen more closely. The scraping stopped. The sudden silence felt sharper than the noise. He adjusted the vent screws with his multi-tool but left the cover in place. When he returned to the main room, he checked the door again. The lock remained secure. Outside, the wind howled across the lot, shaking the walkway railings. He sat on the bed and opened his notebook. Before writing anything, he heard the tap again, this time softer, like something brushing against the metal edge rather than knocking. He whispered, "Who's there?" though he knew the front desk warned him about storm pressure causing false knocks. He turned on the camcorder and aimed it toward the door, placing it on the table. He spoke a brief comment into the microphone about strange noises likely caused by wind. The camera captured the faint draft that moved the curtains slightly. He stepped to the window, but the outside walkway remained empty. At 11:30, the power flickered once. The heater stuttered briefly before restarting. The camcorder remained stable, but its audio began picking up a rhythmic clicking pattern that Elias did not hear with his own ears. He rewound the last few seconds and listened carefully. The clicking repeated at irregular intervals, almost like distant footsteps recorded through interference. He frowned and checked the hallway again through the peephole. Still nothing. He decided to test the lock mechanism to ensure no draft pushed the door. He turned the deadbolt, then pulled lightly on the handle. The door did not budge. As he stepped back, he heard another sound, this time from behind him. A soft sliding noise near the window. When he turned, the curtains swayed slightly though. No wind entered the room. He approached the window and pressed his hand against the glass. It felt colder than expected, almost icy. A faint vibration traveled through the window frame, which made him step back. The vibration lasted 3 seconds, then faded. He checked outside again, but the walkway lights flickered unpredictably as the storm worsened. Snow pressed hard against the edges of the frame, which explained some of the draft, though the vibration remained unexplained. He returned to the table and faced the camcorder. The indicator light blinked slowly. He reviewed another short segment and noticed brief distortions in the audio that resembled whisper-like tones layered under the clicking. The tones carried no clear words, only rough syllables shaped by interference. He wrote in his notebook that extreme cold sometimes caused metal in older buildings to shift, which created similar patterns. Just after midnight, he sat back on the bed with the lamp off, leaving only the camcorder recording. The heater hummed steadily. The storm outside roared against the walls. The room felt colder despite the warmth coming from the vent. He covered himself with the blanket, but remained alert after the earlier noises. Another tap hit the door, this one louder. He rose slowly and approached, his hand hovering near the handle. Through the peephole, he saw nothing at first. Then he noticed a subtle shadow shift near the railing, not shaped like a person, but more like a piece of windblown debris passing close to the light. When he blinked, the shadow vanished entirely. He backed away and checked the camcorder to confirm it captured the sound. The audio spiked at the moment of the tap, followed by a low static rumble that did not match ambient wind. He sat again and listened carefully. A dull thud struck the wall behind the headboard as if something hit the outside siding. The impact did not repeat. Around 12:45, the room temperature dropped sharply. The heater still ran, yet the air felt thin and cold. His breath became visible in the dim light. He stood near the bathroom door and felt an even colder draft slip from the vent. He opened the vent cover slightly and saw nothing inside except darkness. Yet the cold intensified enough to cause a mild ache in his hands. The camcorder captured his movements from across the room. It recorded the moment he approached the vent and the moment he stepped back. It also recorded a faint metallic scrape echoing inside the duct. Elias heard it too this time, a slow, dragging scrape, distant but deliberate. He whispered, "Is someone in there?" Then waited. The scrape stopped instantly. It's courting by sign and his letter in 2022 people, and this stopped and be in the manic, and make from mustable with but these son so and never in percentage time. He closed the vent cover firmly and secured the screws. As he turned toward the main room, he heard soft clicking beneath the carpet near the door. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the floor. The clicking continued in a broken pattern, too slow to be pipes and too rhythmic to be settling wood. It almost resembled a sequence, like metal tapping arranged in a coded repetition. He stepped back and wrote a brief note about the sound. Before he finished the sentence, the power flickered a second time. The lamp shut off completely. Only the dim LED on the camcorder continued glowing. The heater stopped. The room fell silent except for wind outside and the faint click inside the duct. Elias sat near the camcorder so its microphone could capture any continued noise. The LED brightened slightly to compensate for the darkness. Snow pounded against the window so forcefully that the frame creaked. The clicking inside the duct transitioned into a scraping again. It grew slightly louder, then abruptly stopped. A moment later, a new sound echoed from the door. Not a tap, a slow, heavy shift of metal against metal. The deadbolt twisted halfway before stopping. Elias lunged for the handle and locked it again. His breathing sped up as he pressed his weight against the door. The hallway remained silent. Only the wind moved outside. He checked the peephole but saw nothing except the distorted glow of the walkway lights. He stepped back and grabbed his phone even though he had no reception earlier. The screen showed no signal. He powered it off and on again out of habit, but nothing changed. He picked up the camcorder and held it in front of him. The lens caught his anxious breathing and the dim glow from the hallway. He whispered another verbal note, explaining that the deadbolt briefly shifted on its own. As he spoke, a dull thump hit the wall behind him. He spun around but saw nothing. The thump repeated near the window. The curtain fluttered, though the frame remained shut. He approached the window carefully. The frost across the glass formed patterns more severe than before. The center shifted subtly, pulsing outward in rings that looked like breath fogging the other side. He reached forward, ready to wipe the frost with his sleeve. Before he touched the glass, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the room. The camcorder captured the moment the heater vent slammed shut, even though no airflow pushed it. Elias stumbled backward. The crack repeated twice from the bathroom vent. Then silence returned instantly. He grabbed his coat and planned to leave despite the storm. He checked the deadbolt again, but the knob felt warmer than the rest of the door. He twisted the lock. It resisted. He pressed harder. It did not move. The mechanism felt jammed from the inside. He stepped away, gripping the camcorder tightly. The audio feed picked up a faint metallic sequence that sounded like something pulling through narrow tubing. He realized the duct noises no longer came from one direction, but two separate points above him. He backed toward the corner near the bed. The lights flickered once more, though the power remained out. At 1:13, the footage captured the moment Elias's breath clouded heavily beneath the dim LED, thicker than earlier, as if the temperature plunged again. The door rattled once. The window frame vibrated enough to shake the curtain rod. Elias turned the camcorder toward the bathroom just as a final scraping noise echoed through the duct. The recording ended abruptly. The camcorder shut off mid-frame. Staff entered the room the following afternoon after Elias failed to check out. The door remained locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry appeared. The room was undisturbed except for his notebook lying open on the table and faint frost patterns covering the window interior. The temperature inside measured significantly lower than the hallway, even though the heater was functional. His belongings remained untouched. Elias was gone. Investigators found no evidence of intrusion. The camcorder battery drained completely, though the file remained intact. Review teams noted the audio distortions and unusual duct noises, concluding they resulted from storm pressure, faulty ventilation, or electrical fluctuation, though none of those factors aligned perfectly with the sequence captured. Locals still warned travelers about staying in the motel's older rooms during severe January storms. They mentioned the vents carrying strange echoes on the coldest nights and door mechanisms shifting without clear reason. Some former guests claimed to hear tapping from the duct hours before the storm peak, even when no other rooms are occupied. Room 6 remains closed for renovations according to the motel management. Yet people driving past on winter nights sometimes say they see the curtains sway even when no wind touches the windows, as if someone inside still stands near the glass watching the snow drift across the lot. Park rangers were told never to open this gate. The presence of a rusted steel gate deep within the national forest remains one of the most persistent mysteries among the local maintenance crews. This barrier stands at the end of a forgotten access road that the Park Service stopped maintaining over 40 years ago for unknown reasons. Senior rangers often pass down a verbal warning to every new recruit that the lock on the chain must never be cut or replaced. The gate is marked with a simple sign that says authorized personnel only, but no official record exists of what lies on the other side. Silas Vance was a 39-year-old trail maintenance supervisor who spent his decade of service repairing the remote backcountry paths. He arrived at the northern boundary line early on a Tuesday morning with the simple goal of clearing the fallen timber from the winter storms. The weather was unusually calm for that time of year, and Silas expected to finish his clearing work before the heavy fog arrived. He carried a heavy-duty chainsaw and a metal detector to locate any buried survey markers that might have shifted during the recent mudslides. The forest was quiet, and the air felt heavy with the scent of damp moss and old cedar wood that had started to rot. As Silas pushed through a dense thicket of mountain laurel, he stumbled upon the rotted remains of an old asphalt road. He followed the cracked pavement until he saw the silhouette of a heavy black gate that was chained shut with a thick iron lock. The metal was pitted with deep rust, and the surrounding trees had started to grow through the bars of the structure over the many years. Silas stepped toward the barrier and felt the ground vibrate slightly as a low humming sound echoed from the dark valley beyond the hills. He noticed that the chain was cold to the touch and the lock appeared to be fused together by some kind of intense heat. He pushed the gate and noticed a strange scent of ozone and sulfur hanging heavy in the air on the other side of the road. A thick layer of white ash covered the ground and every surface, but the trees beyond the gate looked surprisingly vibrant and healthy. Silas approached a small stone building that sat 50 yards past the entrance and saw a series of radio antennas pointing toward the sky. He found a small wooden box resting beside the front door with a handwritten label that simply said, "Do not enter under any circumstances." The handwriting was cramped and looked as though it had been written by a person who was working under a great deal of stress. According to local archives, the last ranger assigned to this specific sector was a man named Elias Thorne in 1978. Dispatch logs from that year indicate that Elias stopped responding to his radio checks after reporting a series of bright lights over the ridgeline. Search teams combed the surrounding woods for several weeks, but never found a trace of the missing ranger or his Park Service vehicle at all. Silas picked up the wooden box and realized it was the only piece of modern equipment left in the entire abandoned station area. He felt a cold sensation in his chest as he wondered what had truly happened to the man who was told to guard this gate. The supervisor decided to bring the box back to his truck to see if the contents contained any clues about the missing ranger. He spent the next 3 hours hiking back through the dense brush while the sun began to dip below the sharp mountain peaks. Silas felt a strange sense of urgency to open the container and discover why the area had been kept secret for so many decades. He drove back to the main station in silence and immediately began searching for any historical maps of the northern boundary sector. The station was quiet as he sat at his desk and noticed the flickering fluorescent lights reflecting off the metal surface of the box. Silas eventually found a small key inside the desk drawer and used it to pry open the lid of the wooden container that evening. He pulled out a small leather journal and began to read the first entry by the light of his small desk lamp. A voice in his head seemed to form as he read about a series of metallic objects appearing in the valley behind the gate. The man in the journal claimed that the objects were moving in patterns that did not match any known aircraft or military technology. He wrote with a level of detail that suggested he was an experienced observer who was familiar with the typical wildlife of the mountains. The narrator described how the metallic objects would hover over the peaks for hours before disappearing into the deep granite caves that lined the valley walls. Witness statements from 1978 mention similar sightings by residents in the nearby town of Oakhaven during that same late summer month. Elias Thorne reported that he had started hearing a low humming sound coming from the ground beneath the black steel gate every single night. He believed that something was living deep inside the mountain and was using the radio antennas to signal others out in the dark sky. The humming was reportedly so intense that it caused the glass lenses of his binoculars to shatter in his hands while he watched. Silas read closely as the journal captured the description of rhythmic tapping against the exterior walls of the small stone observation building. Elias stopped writing for several hours, and the next entry was a frantic scrawl that was almost impossible to read in the dim light. The ranger wrote that he could see tall figures moving through the trees without making any sound or breaking any of the dry branches. He claimed that the visitors were waiting for him to open the gate so they could move their equipment further into the forest. The tapping was persistent and moved from the walls up to the roof of the cabin with a very terrifying and fluid speed. The investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne had originally concluded that he likely suffered from a mental break and wandered into the ravine. However, the details in the journal suggested that the ranger was documenting a very specific and physical threat to his life and the park. Silas paused his reading and looked at the date on the final page, which was the night before Elias Thorne vanished from the forest. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the description of the thumping in the journal matched a sound he heard. The sound was sharp and sounded like metal striking against the heavy chain of the black gate back at the northern boundary. The final few paragraphs of the journal contained a frantic description of the valley being filled with a bright and blinding blue light. Elias shouted through his pen that the humming sound was vibrating his bones and making his vision blur from the sheer physical pressure. He mentioned that he was going to lock the wooden box and hide it near the door before the figures reached the station. The writing ended abruptly with a long ink smear across the page and the sound of a heavy metallic crash recorded in his memory. Silence filled the office of Silas as he closed the journal and looked out at the dark and empty forest in the distance. Silas contacted the regional director the next morning to share the evidence he had recovered from the wooden box near the hidden gate. A researcher named Marcus Reed examined the journal and confirmed that the paper and ink matched the official supplies used in 1978. They returned to the site of the gate together to look for the Park Service vehicle that Elias Thorne had been driving that year. The woods seemed different under the gray morning light, but the feeling of being watched by something unseen remained heavy on their tired minds. They found a small metal tag buried in the dirt that contained the serial number of the missing truck and a silver ring. The blueprints of the area showed detailed diagrams of a tunnel system that extended several miles beneath the mountain and into the restricted valley sector. One image captured a large circular structure that was not part of any original Park Service engineering plans for the northern boundary or roads. Marcus noted that the silver ring had strange symbols etched into the band that did not belong to any known human language or culture. They realized that Elias Thorne had not simply walked away, but had been taken into a place that existed far beneath the mountain peaks. The symbols on the ring began to glow with a soft light when the men brought it near the gate. The authorities sealed the road leading to the northern boundary with a thick layer of concrete and new warning signs to prevent any trespassing. Silas often thinks about the quiet ranger and the man who spent his final hours recording a warning for anyone who found the box. The journal serves as a haunting reminder that some gates are kept locked for a very specific and dark reason that we may never understand. He no longer works on the backcountry trails because the low humming sound still echoes in his ears whenever the forest gets too quiet. The gate remains locked and forgotten by the public, but the forest still holds the secret of what happened in 1978. Every time Silas looks at the northern ridge, he remembers the frantic handwriting of the lost ranger named Elias Thorne in that old journal. He kept a photocopy of the pages in a secure file, but he rarely has the courage to look at the final ink smear again. The researcher, Marcus Reed, resigned from his position shortly after the investigation ended, and he never spoke of the silver ring or the symbols. Local legends continue to grow about the locked gate and the blue lights that still appear over the peaks during the summer. Silas knows that the truth is buried deep in the granite, where the vibrations never truly stopped moving through the mountain and trees. In this new story, archived Winter Patrol summaries describe a remote ski lodge where several visitors reportedly vanished during January storms across multiple decades. Officials never confirmed foul play, which left the lodge classified as a low-priority site despite the strange overlap in dates. Old regional bulletins noted that each disappearance occurred within days of the first heavy snowfall, which created a pattern difficult to ignore. Ronan Kessler, a 36-year-old field technician, received a routine task on a freezing morning when his supervisor asked him to inspect abandoned power lines near that ridge. The request surprised him because the site had not appeared on maintenance schedules for years. He prepared his truck with insulated gear, his weather-worn notebook, and a sturdy radio known to survive interference. The early sky looked pale and washed out, which usually signaled an incoming storm building behind the mountains. He drove up the single-lane access road, which climbed steadily until trees vanished behind blankets of white. Drifts covered the route, which forced him to stop several times to clear ice near the wheel wells. When he reached the last turn, he saw the lodge looming through shifting snow. The structure looked crooked from years of neglect, yet fresh footprints led directly to the warped front door. That detail unsettled him because archives mentioned no active crews assigned to the lodge during winter. Ronan stepped out while the wind whipped icy flakes across the ridge. He approached the entrance slowly since the wooden deck creaked under his boots. A rusted metal sign hung sideways above the door while strands of caution tape fluttered against a railing. The smell of cold pine mixed with a faint chemical scent that reminded him of old industrial labs. He hesitated before pushing open the door, which groaned loudly under layers of ice. Inside, he found a lobby coated in dust and frost. Faded ski posters sagged from the walls, and a collapsed rental counter leaned at an awkward angle. The chemical odor strengthened, which made him breathe shallowly through his scarf. He stood still to listen for movement because abandoned structures often held unexpected hazards. The silence felt oppressive and heavy, like the lodge was absorbing sounds rather than echoing them. A sudden metallic clash rang from a far corridor, which made him tighten his grip on the flashlight. Snow blew through a cracked window, adding a restless whisper to the emptiness. He said quietly, "Hello," while hoping to flush out any squatters. No answer came, which increased his concern. He walked toward the noise with careful steps because uneven floors hid under piles of broken plaster. Halfway down the corridor, he found a steel grate leaning against the wall. Its weight and finish did not match the lodge design, which suggested someone installed it recently. Behind it, he saw a narrow maintenance stairwell missing from old blueprints. He documented the discovery with several photos, then stepped back because the chemical smell grew overwhelming near the stairwell opening. Steam-like condensation rose upward, which felt too warm for an abandoned building in deep winter. Ronan returned to the main corridor and entered a storage room where the door hung crooked on a single hinge. A tripod stood in the center of the room with a camera aimed at a roughly cut hole in the wall. Dust covered everything except the lens, which shone clean in his flashlight beam. The battery compartment sat empty, which suggested deliberate removal. He wrote a quick note in his book about the setup because the arrangement looked designed rather than accidental. A heavy thump sounded from the upper floor, which shook loose frost from exposed rafters. Ronan flinched, then steadied himself before climbing the staircase. The wooden steps bowed under his weight, which forced him to test each board before moving forward. On the landing, he discovered rooms stripped nearly to their frames. One room held several winter jackets arranged neatly along a wall. The jackets looked too new for the lodge and showed no signs of mold, which indicated they had not been here long. He checked a tag that matched a model released only a few years earlier. Near a toppled dresser, he found an emergency service patch tucked between floorboards. The fabric looked clean, which meant someone had dropped it recently. He placed it inside an evidence envelope because the detail felt too important to ignore. Outside the window, he saw the storm intensify until the sky turned white. Snowfall thickened to the point that distant tree lines disappeared. Ronan followed smaller footprints leading toward the lounge where skylight glass had collapsed into hardened ice. The prints cut through drifts before stopping at a kitchen door. He opened it and found a metal table dragged across the floor, leaving long scrape marks. Beneath the table, a wooden hatch stood open, which revealed a stairwell carved into darkness. The chemical smell rushed outward with surprising force, which made him recoil. A faint cough drifted up from the stairwell, which made him freeze. He whispered, "I hear you," and waited. A weak voice answered with a strained plea for help. He descended cautiously because unstable structures could collapse unexpectedly. At the bottom, he found a basement lined with insulation sheets arranged almost like padding. Several portable heaters stood unplugged yet positioned in a deliberate pattern. A pulley system hung overhead with ropes stretched tightly across beams. Behind a crate, he found a woman in her early 20s slumped against the wall with frostbitten fingers and a torn parka. Her voice trembled as she tried to explain what happened. She and a friend entered the lodge 2 days earlier when they were caught in a sudden storm. They heard machinery deeper inside and approached it, believing it might lead to shelter. She remembered stepping on a section of floor that dropped suddenly, which sent her falling into the basement while her friend tried to pull her up. She lost consciousness shortly afterward. Ronan checked her pulse, which felt weak yet steady. He guided her to sit upright against a crate, then searched for signs of the missing friend. Near the pulley system, he found boot impressions similar to the prints upstairs. Scratch marks lined a wooden frame that hid a recessed pressure plate. Someone had tried to pry open the frame using a flat tool. He moved the frame aside with effort, which revealed the plate covered in dust except for a single clean fingerprint. When he pressed the plate lightly, a loud click came from the ceiling, which sounded like a mechanical trigger resetting. He realized the lodge had been altered with a system of hidden traps that responded to pressure changes and weight distribution. The craftsmanship required knowledge beyond casual tinkering. Someone built these modifications intentionally and likely over several winters. A sudden crack from above signaled the hatch beginning to close under its own power. Ronan grabbed the woman and hurried up the stairs as the door slammed shut behind them. The echo vibrated through the corridor, which reminded him of controlled mechanisms, not typical decay. They entered the kitchen where the room groaned under storm pressure. The wind roared through broken vents, which matched the earlier warm draft rising from the stairwell. In the lobby, he noticed the steel grate along the hallway beginning to slide across the floor. The movement looked unnatural because no visible motor powered it. He rushed forward while supporting the woman and jammed a fallen ski pole under the grate, which slowed its closing. They slipped past into the snow as the grate clanged shut behind them with finality. Outside, the storm battered them with bursts of icy wind. Ronan wrapped her in a heavy blanket and secured her in the truck before starting the engine. The wheels spun until they caught traction along the icy path. The descent took hours, while visibility dropped to almost nothing. The constant drum of sleet against the windshield nearly drowned out the woman's occasional murmurs. They reached a ranger station before midnight, where medics treated her for exposure. She offered fragmented details about clicking noises and shifting floors. Investigators interviewed her over several days, though her memory blurred around the moment the floor collapsed. She insisted she heard breathing near the walls during the hours before she fell. When authorities reached the lodge several days later, they found much of the mechanical system dismantled. The pulley framework remained, though the ropes were cut and several gears removed. Inspectors noted inconsistent footprints around the stairwell, suggesting someone visited after Ronan escaped. The jackets in the upper room had vanished, and the tripod camera was gone, along with the clean lens. Ronan accompanied a second team to verify details in his original report. The lodge interior looked different from his earlier visit, which unsettled him. Several rooms had collapsed ceilings that were intact days before. Marks on the floor that once indicated mechanical movement now appeared faint or replaced with scattered debris. Only the pressure plate remained unchanged, though it now sat covered with a fine layer of frost. Later analysis of regional utility files uncovered an unregistered service request from a contractor using a false company name. The request dated back many winters and mentioned delivery of specialized metal components to a site matching the lodge's coordinates. Investigators never traced the contractor despite repeated attempts. During a follow-up search, rangers found an old sled buried under several feet of snow behind the building. The sled carried fragments of rope identical to fibers in the basement pulley system. They also discovered a rusted metal frame with adjustable weights similar to early counterbalance prototypes used in training facilities many decades earlier. Ronan provided additional notes describing temperature shifts he felt inside the lodge, which suggested hidden vents still operated despite no visible power source. Technicians checked for backup generators but found none. They concluded that stored mechanical energy might have powered some of the systems, though no clear explanation emerged. The missing hiker eventually recovered enough to share more details. They remembered hearing rhythmic knocking sounds shortly before becoming separated. They believed the sound came from within the walls, though investigators could not confirm it. The hiker recalled climbing through a tight service gap before blacking out on the ridge, which explained their location when found. Local residents discussed the incident throughout the season. Some believed the lodge served as a clandestine workshop for an unknown engineer fascinated with pressure-triggered traps. Others suspected the place was used as a winter hideout by someone who did not want company. A few claimed older generations whispered about strange noises near that ridge long before the lodge existed. Ronan avoided the site after his final visit because every clue pointed toward deliberate manipulation rather than random decay. The combination of warm drafts, shifting floors, and automated grates suggested a creator who still visited during heavy storms. He often replayed the moment the grate moved by itself, which convinced him the system remained active even after partial dismantling. Authorities secured the area with new barriers and updated warnings. The lodge still stands, buried under January snow. Windows rattle during storms, which gives the building a faint pulse, like a living thing adjusting to winter pressure. Those who approach claim the lodge feels watchful. The basement stairwell remains the most disturbing feature because even sealed doors cannot hide the subtle warmth drifting upward long after all mechanisms supposedly stopped. Ronan believes someone mastered the rhythm of storms and used the lodge to test ideas during the quietest nights. The deeper truth remains locked within those walls, where sound, machinery, and winter silence blend into something quietly waiting for the next January visitor who wanders too close to a place that never fully lets go of its secrets. Why investigators stopped searching this forest trail. Search and rescue logs from the summer of 1994 contain several redacted entries regarding a popular hiking trail. These official documents mention a series of unexplained events that forced local authorities to permanently close the entire wooded area to the public. Silas Thorne was a 48-year-old forest ranger who spent his career patrolling the rugged northern ridgelines in the park. He was a practical man who understood the dangers of the wilderness and respected the unpredictable nature of the high mountains. Silas lived in a small cabin near the park entrance and kept a detailed journal of every unusual sighting he encountered. One humid morning in August, he received a report about a group of hikers who had vanished near the valley stream. The trail was a well-marked path that thousands of people used every single year without any major safety concerns. He packed his medical kit and checked his topographical maps to plan a search route through the dense green forest. Silas drove his government truck to the trailhead and noticed that the morning birds were unusually quiet in the heavy air. He reported his position to the station and mentioned that a thick fog was starting to settle over the lower valley. A strange metallic humming sound coming from the trees made him pause as he adjusted his heavy nylon backpack straps. He looked toward the thick brush, but the sound was not coming from any mechanical equipment or known service vehicles. Silas continued down the dirt path and noticed that the trail markers had been moved from their original wooden posts. He saw a bright orange ribbon tied to a branch that led deep into a section of the woods labeled off limits. The ranger decided to follow the ribbon to see if the missing hikers had wandered into the dangerous rocky terrain. The forest became incredibly dark as the trees grew closer together, and the sun was blocked by the thick canopy. He looked at his compass and realized the needle was spinning in rapid circles without pointing toward the North Pole. Silas stopped walking and noticed that his heavy boots were leaving deep indentations in the soil that glowed with purple light. The glowing soil started to vibrate as a low-frequency pulse echoed through the floor of the quiet, dark forest. Silas checked his emergency radio for a signal, but the device only produced a series of rhythmic and high clicks. He knew that the local geology was not capable of producing magnetic interference of this specific and intense magnitude. The clicks on the radio stopped, and a voice began to whisper a set of names that sounded familiar to him. Silas grabbed his official logbook and realized the names belonged to people who had gone missing in 1972. He looked at the trees and saw that the bark had been carved with hundreds of small and intricate geometric patterns. The ranger followed the carvings until he reached a clearing where the trees had been pushed by an incredible force. He saw a white tent standing in the center of the clearing that appeared to be brand new and very clean. The tent was unoccupied, but the interior was filled with rows of glass jars that contained different types of soil. Silas stepped inside the tent and saw a small table with a silver tray holding a collection of silver rings. Each ring had a date engraved on the inside that matched the years of the most famous local missing cases. Silas realized that these items were not left behind by hikers, but were being displayed as a specific collection. He found a handheld recorder on the table that was actively capturing the sounds of the forest outside the white tent. Silas pressed the playback button and heard a recording of his own truck arriving at the trailhead recently. The recording included the sound of him speaking into his radio about the thick fog and the quiet birds today. He felt a sharp pain in his chest as a bright flash of light filled the small and white tent. Silas ran out of the tent and scrambled back toward the main trail as the ground began to shake. He reached his truck and drove toward the ranger station without stopping to check for the missing hikers again. Silas told his supervisor about the glowing soil and the silver rings and the strange recordings in the woods. The supervisor looked at the maps and told Silas that the clearing he described did not exist on any survey. A team of 20 investigators returned to the forest trail the following morning to search for any signs of the tent. They found the orange ribbon and the spinning compasses, but the clearing was nothing but a wall of trees. There was no glowing soil and no white tent and no collection of silver rings in the area. The lead investigator looked at Silas and asked if he had been experiencing any symptoms of heat stroke. Silas pulled a single silver ring from his pocket to prove that he had actually been inside the tent. He opened his hand, but the ring had turned into a piece of brittle wood that crumbled into dust. The authorities decided to stop the search and permanently closed the forest trail to protect the public from events. Silas resigned from the Forest Service and moved to a coastal town where there were no trees at all. He kept his original journal, but the pages describing that day were now completely blank and smelled like ozone. He realized that the things he saw in the forest were part of a cycle that repeated often. Silas never went hiking again because he knew that some trails lead to places that do not exist. The forest trail remains closed to this day and is heavily patrolled by private security teams in uniforms. Construction crews tried to pave over the area in 2012, but their heavy machinery failed every time. No records of the missing hikers were ever found in the state archives, and their families stopped asking questions. Silas Thorne lived the rest of his life in silence and never spoke about the glowing purple soil again. Some mysteries are buried so deep in the woods that they are better left for the trees to guard. The truth about why they stopped searching remains hidden under the thick canopy and the silence of the ridge. Silas often wondered if the recordings he heard were being played for someone else who had entered the woods. He knew the forest had its own way of reclaiming the things that people tried to document and report. The strange frequency that he heard on the radio was never detected by any other official equipment in the park. The trail is now overgrown with thorns and heavy brush that makes it nearly impossible for anyone to pass. Local legends say that the birds still go silent whenever the fog begins to roll in from the north. Silas left his journal to the local historical society, but the specific entries about the white tent were gone. Investigators eventually stopped visiting the site after several members of the security team reported hearing voices in the static. The state government removed the trail from all modern maps to ensure that no curious travelers would get lost. The case of the vanishing hikers from 1994 was officially listed as an unsolved wilderness accident. Silas Thorne died knowing that the collection in the white tent was likely still growing with every passing cycle. The woods remain a place where the rules of the world do not always apply to those who enter. His footprints from that day were reported to have faded within minutes of his escape from the clearing. Internal reports suggested that radiation levels in the closed area stayed above normal for several years following the event. Witnesses from nearby towns occasionally report seeing pulsing lights appearing behind the trees when the moon is high. No new investigation has been launched due to fear of what might be rediscovered in the dark of the woods. Silas often sat on the pier of his coastal home, staring at the ocean and wondering about the others. He knew that human memory is a fragile thing that can be easily changed by forces we do not understand. The brown dust from the wooden ring remained in a small jar on his mantle as a silent reminder. Events at the Northern Forest Trail will never be fully reported to avoid mass panic in the general region. Local residents still talk about the disappearances when they gather at the old coffee shop on the edge of town. They know that parts of the mountain do not want to be disturbed by human presence or technology. The secret of 1994 is locked behind the chain-link fence that now surrounds the forest area. Silas Thorne took the secret of the radio whispers to his grave without ever sharing them with anyone. The trees will continue to grow and cover all physical evidence until nothing is left but a fading legend. Whenever the wind blows hard from the north, people remember the last warning written by the forest ranger. Do not follow the orange ribbons that do not lead you back home because the woods have their collection. This story ends as a reminder that the wilderness still holds dark corners that we will never truly master. The purple light Silas saw beneath his feet was perhaps a sign of something older than human history itself. The area is now a dead zone for all modern communication signals, and no satellite can take clear images. The forest has swallowed the past and the future into a single entity that cannot be pierced by logic. Silas Thorne went in peace, but his eyes always turned toward the north as if he were waiting. The mystery of the forest trail will remain part of the darkest secrets of the earth among the trees. The truth the investigators sought was ultimately just a reflection of their own fear of the deep unknown. The popular hiking trail is now just a name in an old document that is yellowing and fading. The silence there is a type of silence that speaks of things that are better left unheard or unseen. New rangers are now given strict instructions to avoid the perimeter fence without asking any medical or operational questions. The path that was once full of families and laughter is now reclaimed by a darkness that refuses to leave. Silas knew that the collection of rings was just a small part of a much larger and darker truth. The world is much stranger than the maps lead us to believe when we walk under the ancient trees. In this new story, archived winter investigation files from 3 different counties describe a particular stretch of mountain highway where whiteouts reportedly form faster than radio towers can update alerts. The phenomenon repeats every December. It isn't marked on public maps, authorities never officially classify it as hazardous, yet everyone living within 50 miles knows exactly which section it is. Locals simply call it the Ridge, travelers call it Cursed, and truckers who use the road at night learn quickly that you cannot outrun a whiteout there because the storms behave like something alive. Lennox Rourke, a 37-year-old contracted supply driver, drove that highway on a mid-December evening under a sky that looked too still for winter. The air felt heavy rather than cold, the kind of pressure that builds before storms gather but hides long enough to trick forecasters. He finished loading equipment crates onto the bed of his truck, tightened the straps twice, then checked his chains, flare kit, first aid bag, and the battery in his handheld radio. He kept a heavy thermos of coffee beside him, a habit formed after 20 winters spent hauling supplies into the mountains. He left the last outpost before dusk, following the two-lane highway into a narrow canyon where wind usually howled through rock cuts. That night, the canyon remained silent. Not a single gust, not a single shifting branch. He watched his breath curl in the cab and felt the strange stillness press against the windows like a held breath. Snow lingered in small flurries that drifted in lazy spirals. The clouds above the ridge formed long, undisturbed sheets that glowed faintly in the fading light. 10 miles up, he noticed a pair of fresh tire tracks on the snow-coated pavement. They belonged to a smaller vehicle, likely a compact sedan judging by the width. The tracks wobbled toward the outer shoulder several times before correcting. Whoever drove ahead wasn't confident on the ice. Lennox radioed a routine position update, received static instead of a response, and slowed his speed as he approached a long curve that overlooked a steep ravine. Through his headlights, he saw the parked sedan. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. Snow piled against the bumper. The driver door hung open. He pulled behind it and stepped out into a sudden gust that didn't match the earlier calm. Snow stung his cheeks. The seat inside the sedan held a thin layer of frost, as if the driver abandoned it recently. A half-written note lay on the passenger floor. It described disorientation, a strange pulsing glare over the ridge, and worsening visibility ahead. The scrawled handwriting ended mid-sentence in a long, jagged mark. Footprints led into the dense timberline, then vanished abruptly where the wind swept through the trees. Lennox called out, but only swirling snow answered. He checked the trunk and glove compartment, confirming no luggage or wallet remained. It looked like the driver fled in a panic. He radioed dispatch again, but the signal cut in and out, the interference sharp and pulsing in sync with unseen static. He continued up the highway because the research lodge needed its supplies before temperatures dropped overnight. Snow deepened quickly. He flicked on the high beams and leaned forward as he climbed another 1,000 feet of elevation. The wind returned with sudden force, carrying sheets of white across the pavement. The whiteout formed instantly. In less than a second, his world turned to blinding white. His beams reflected back into his cab like a wall of light. The road disappeared beneath swirling frost. He slowed to a crawl, searching for the faint yellow line beneath the snow. The truck groaned as the wind shoved at its side. Then he felt it. A deep, rolling vibration beneath the pavement. It rumbled through the steering column and into his arms. At first, he thought he drove over cracked asphalt, but the vibration repeated in a pattern far too regular to be natural. It felt like machinery working under the road, pulsing in slow waves. A hollow hum filled the cab, not a noise from the engine, but something distant traveling through the ground. He gripped the wheel tighter and whispered to himself that he only needed to reach the next turnout. But the storm had erased every landmark. His radio crackled violently before going silent. Even emergency frequencies fell into total static. Through the swirling white, he saw a faint glow, dim and warm like a lantern or flare. It pulsed twice, then faded. The storm swallowed it whole. He finally spotted the turnout sign half buried under wind-shaped drifts. He turned into it and killed the engine. The moment the truck stilled, the world fell silent, except for the soft hiss of snow against the windows. The vibration beneath the ground returned, stronger this time. He stepped out and instantly felt the storm slam him sideways. Snow whipped across his vision in chaotic bursts. Still, he saw it again, the distant lantern-like glow flickering far down the ridge, swaying as if carried by an unsteady hand. He raised his flashlight and followed the glow. Each step sank past his ankles. The wind roared so loudly he barely heard his breathing. The lantern glow brightened, then dimmed. When he reached the ridge edge, the wind paused, just briefly, revealing a trail of fresh footprints descending into a narrow gap between two boulders. He followed the prints to a sheltered clearing, where the wind died completely. There, he found a metal service box half buried in ice. Its door hung open, clinking softly in the breeze. Inside, a flickering emergency lamp illuminated piles of old engineering logs scattered across the snow. He brushed frost off one page and read that decades ago, crews tried stabilizing the ridge after discovering deep fractures extending several miles beneath the highway. Some fractures reportedly produced heavy vibrations during cold snaps, others echoed with humming noises long after construction equipment shut down. One engineer wrote that whiteouts triggered surface shifts powerful enough to knock tools off tables. Another recorded flashes of color during storms that turned the snow blue for a moment before fading. None of the entries ended optimistically. The project halted after a series of unexplained injuries. The final pages contained abrupt, shaky handwriting as if recorded in haste before crews evacuated the area. The wind returned violently, slamming the service box door against its hinge. Snow blasted across the clearing, burying the footprints behind Lennox in seconds. He attempted to climb back to the turnout, but the storm collapsed around him. The whiteout erased all shape, all direction, all sense of slope. The vibration beneath the ground grew into a steady pulse. He dropped one knee into the drift, bracing himself. Then the light appeared again, this time brighter, bluish, and closer. It flashed once, then again. It illuminated the storm like lightning flickering inside a closed room. He shielded his face as the vibration stopped abruptly, leaving a deep ringing in his ears. When the storm eased momentarily, he recognized the outline of his truck barely 30 yards uphill. He pushed through the drifts and climbed into the cab with shaking hands. His headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. And then something struck the back of the truck. Not a rock, not debris, something heavy enough to shift the entire chassis. He looked through the rear window but saw only churning white. When the dash lights returned, he noticed new tracks behind his vehicle footprints moving in a staggering, uneven pattern. They circled the back of the truck twice before stopping abruptly at an untouched drift. No exit trail. No continuation. Just sudden absence. The radio crackled violently. A voice broke through for half a second, a woman screaming a word he couldn't understand. The signal collapsed again before the dispatcher came through, faintly asking for his status. Lennox forced his voice steady as he reported everything he'd seen. She ordered him to return immediately. The descent felt endless. Whiteout pockets still erupted at random, swallowing the world in sudden blindness before releasing it again. Snow reflected his taillights in ghostly red bursts. The mountain behind him pulsed with silent flashes he could not explain. Only when he reached the lower forest line did the storm finally weaken. Search teams reached the abandoned sedan the next morning. The seat still held a thin layer of frost. The driver never returned. No prints remained except deep indentations captured in early photographs. A team located the service box clearing and retrieved the logs, confirming chronic seismic anomalies beneath that stretch of highway. Several log entries matched the timing of Lennox's report almost exactly. But the most disturbing discovery came from the audio files engineers recovered from Lennox's malfunctioning radio. Buried beneath the static, analysts detected irregular pulses matching the tremor pattern of underground shifts too deep and too rhythmic to be caused by ordinary geological movement. Locals still warn travelers never to trust the ridge's calm skies. They say the whiteouts there do not behave like normal storms. They arrive instantly. They vanish instantly. And sometimes, during the brightest flashes, they reveal silhouettes of things standing where no person could stand. Some claim to hear humming beneath the tires just before the visibility collapses. Others swear the snow glows blue right before the tremors begin. Lennox refuses to drive that highway now. He told investigators he can still feel the vibration in his bones when he thinks about the storm. And he still dreams about the footprints appearing behind his truck, circling twice before ending nowhere, as if something walked there only long enough to watch him through the snow. He knows one thing for certain. On that mountain highway, you cannot outrun a whiteout. Not because it moves fast, but because it feels like the storm is already waiting for you the moment you decide to climb the ridge. And once the wind closes, there is no direction, only white, only echoes, and only the sense that something beneath the road finally woke up. In this new story, a forgotten winter incident recorded in an old county archive still raises questions about a lake house found half frozen during a historic storm. Investigators who later revisited the file admitted that several details continued to unsettle them despite careful reviews and steady cross-checks. Ryland Keats was 36 and worked as a custom woodworker who often stayed near remote lakes to sketch designs when his schedule finally slowed. He planned a quiet weekend away from clients and rented a small lake house managed by an older couple who lived several miles down the shoreline. The couple noted that Ryland seemed calm and said he hoped to enjoy a frozen lakeside walk before snow deepened across the region later that night. He arrived at the house before dusk and placed his sketch bag near a window overlooking the lake, which reflected sheets of early forming ice. Weather alerts shifted rapidly that evening when meteorologists warned of air pressure collapse across the county, which could generate dangerous gusts. Ryland attempted a brief walk along the frozen shoreline, but turned back quickly after hearing loud cracks traveling beneath the surface of the ice. He contacted the property owners by radio to say he would stay inside until daylight because the temperature had dropped faster than expected. The owners logged the call and mentioned that previous storms once caused strange echo patterns across the lake due to the ice reacting to pressure. The incident began when the owners attempted a routine check later that night and received only faint static along with short metallic pulses. A ranger named Mallory Sabin was on patrol nearby and overheard clipped transmissions that sounded like someone speaking under severe interference. She tried raising Ryland twice, but his signal dissolved quickly, so she drove her snow-capable truck toward the lake house despite worsening visibility. She later reported that gusts pushed ice fragments across the road and forced her to stop several times as shifting snow erased tire tracks ahead. Mallory reached the house after dark and noticed an unusual blue glow flickering through the frosted window, which resembled a lantern struggling. She knocked and called Ryland's name because property records confirmed he was the only guest staying at the lake house that weekend. There was no response, so she tried the door, which opened without resistance, even though the hinges were nearly frozen from the rising storm. Inside, she saw Ryland's jacket on a chair and his sketchbook open on the table, displaying a half-drawn shoreline image that stopped abruptly. The lantern on the counter flickered strangely while Mallory inspected the room and attempted to understand the heavy quiet that filled the house. She called for Ryland again and moved carefully across the floor because thin frost had formed on the boards near the back door earlier that evening. A mug of cooling coffee sat beside a scattered pencil set, and a single boot lay near the hallway, which suggested hurried movement. Deputies later observed that the back door showed a narrow ice seam along its edge, which indicated it had been opened briefly during freezing gusts. Two deputies arrived and began searching the lakeside in slow expanding arcs, though their lights struggled to cut through drifting powder. They found footprints near the back porch that led toward the frozen lake, but the trail vanished where the wind had swept the surface clean. Deputies noted the prints were uneven, as if Ryland had changed direction suddenly or slipped where ice formed ridges under the fresh snow. They attempted to follow the faint path, but retreated when loud groans echoed across the lake, suggesting unstable ice beneath their weight. Inside the house, investigators documented scattered belongings, which indicated Ryland had started packing before stepping outside unexpectedly. His phone rested near the lantern with a cracked screen and displayed a half-written message that ended mid-sentence during interference. The message referenced a deep thud outside, which he believed came from shifting lake ice reacting to sudden changes in temperature. But investigators discovered no crater or collapse in the ice near the house, which forced them to question whether the sound had originated elsewhere. Environmental sensors around the lake recorded a brief pressure dip during the same time Ryland drafted the message, though the cause was unclear. Experts explained that lakes sometimes emit strong acoustic shocks when rapid temperature changes cause layers of ice to buckle under tension. However, a house inspection revealed a warped floorboard near the back entry, which did not match typical swelling caused by cold exposure. Deputies examining the interior walls found frost patterns shaped in long vertical lines, which suggested a sudden airflow surge inside the house. At sunrise, search teams returned to the frozen lake, where visibility allowed them to identify old guide stakes placed along a historic walking route. One stake near a small inlet leaned at an unnatural angle, and beneath it they found a torn scrap from the lining of Ryland's missing glove. The scrap was lightly frozen to the ice, which implied it had been exposed only briefly before overnight snowfall covered the lake. This discovery directed teams toward a series of narrow cracks that extended from the inlet into deeper sections of the frozen water. A volunteer team followed the cracks carefully and located a shallow indentation where someone had slid or fallen based on surface scratches. They also found a small hand radio half buried in frost near a break in the ice, which matched the registration number assigned to the lake house. The radio showed deep scratches and a bent antenna, which indicated hard impact likely caused during a fall rather than intentional use. Divers later searched beneath the break, but limited visibility and shifting ice prevented a thorough inspection of deeper sections of the lake. Investigators theorized that Ryland stepped outside after hearing the deep thud he referenced and attempted to determine whether the ice was shifting. They believed he approached the lake's edge during a temporary lull and misjudged distance because whiteout bands obscured the shoreline. He likely slipped along an ice ridge and slid toward the inlet, where the surface cracked under his weight during the most intense winds. Teams expanded their search radius for another day, but new fractures formed across the lake, forcing them to halt operations for safety. Weeks later, audio technicians revisited Ryland's final radio attempts and isolated a strange harmonic resonance behind his voice. The tone resembled a layered echo that did not match typical interference caused by weather patterns over frozen lakes. One analyst suggested the sound might have come from stressed ice plates striking each other in rapid succession, though he admitted the timing felt off. Another believed the resonance resembled an underwater pressure fluctuation, though no equipment existed at the lake to confirm such activity. Investigators continued reviewing notes from the house, including frost lines, warped boards, and unexplained temperature fluctuations. Some experts proposed that a rapid pressure burst through the inlet could have forced cold air into the house, creating vertical frost streaks. Others argued that the warped floorboard suggested localized vibration strong enough to disrupt the house structure briefly during the storm. None of the theories fit perfectly with sensor records, which remained inconsistent during peak storm period due to equipment failures. Later interviews with previous winter visitors revealed that strange acoustic booms occasionally echoed across the lake during sudden freezes. Several described moments when ice plates shifted and sent sharp pressure waves toward the shoreline, though none mentioned structural effects. One visitor recalled the lantern inside the lake house flickering violently during a past storm, which matched what Mallory observed on arrival. These accounts supported the idea of unique lake conditions, but still failed to explain the floor distortion found during the investigation. A geological survey conducted months later identified several deep fissures beneath the frozen lake caused by long-term structural changes underwater. Surveyors suggested that rare pressure events might occur when unstable ice layers collapsed under shifting weight during extreme cold snaps. They believed such pressure bursts could generate the sounds Ryland heard, though they emphasized that events strong enough to deform a building were unusual. This theory aligned with some evidence, but still left major questions unanswered, especially regarding the warped floor and sudden airflow patterns. Despite extensive efforts, investigators agreed that Ryland most likely slipped into the frozen inlet after approaching the lake during unstable conditions. Whiteout gusts combined with shifting ice would have created disorientation and masked dangerous sections where cracks formed beneath accumulating snow. However, the unusual frost patterns inside the house and the warped floorboard continued to unsettle specialists who studied the case years later. These anomalies appeared in the final report, which labeled the precise trigger for Ryland's exit as unresolved due to conflicting evidence. Seasonal crews installed warning signs along the inlet, urging winter visitors to avoid the frozen lake during rapid temperature shifts. The lake house owners updated their safety guidelines, advising guests to stay indoors during sharp pressure changes detected by regional sensors. Training programs across the county referenced the case to demonstrate the sudden hazards associated with frozen lakes during severe storms. Yet the puzzle of Ryland's final moments remained open for debate among investigators who believed key atmospheric details were still missing. Experts who revisit the file today agree that the case endures not because of impossible theories, but because of small, unexplained contradictions. The harmonic audio resonance, the warped floorboard, and the frost lines inside the lake house each resist simple interpretation. Most investigators conclude that Ryland likely suffered an accidental fall while attempting to understand the deep thud he heard outside that evening. The case endures in local memory as a haunting reminder that frozen lakes can hide unpredictable forces capable of overwhelming even careful visitors.